Elden Ring has some genuinely unsettling secrets buried in its code that most players will never see, and today we are going through all of them. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So, a bit about why I made this video. I have been deep in Elden Ring's files for a while now, and the more I dug, the more I realized that From Software left an enormous amount of material in the game's code that never made it into the final product. Some of it is eerie, some of it reframes things you thought you understood. When I was putting this together, I made a deliberate choice to focus not just on cut content or unused assets, but on the stuff that actually changes how the existing lore reads. There is a lot of content out there about what was removed. What I found more interesting was what was hidden and what that hiding tells us about the game's intent. I also made the call to exclude most of the purely technical findings, like frame data and hitbox values, because honestly, that is a different video. This one is about story, about meaning, about the things From Software may not have wanted you to find, or may have absolutely wanted you to find, and just buried deep enough that only the obsessive ones would get there. Let's get into it. The first thing you need to understand is that Elden Ring's code is not clean. That is not a criticism. It is actually the opposite. It is layered, contradictory in places, and full of material that suggests the development team was working through multiple versions of the story simultaneously. Data miners have found enemy types that exist in the files but appear nowhere in the world. They have found dialogue lines for characters who are either dead when you meet them or who never speak at all in the shipped game. And they have found entire flag systems, the back-end variables the game uses to track player choices and world states, that are set up and never triggered. That last one is the most interesting to me, and we are going to spend a lot of time on it. But let's start with something more visceral. There is an enemy type in the code referred to internally as a variant of the Omen. You know the Omens. They are the horn-bearing figures the game treats as cursed, as something to be hidden away and destroyed. Morgott, Moog, the ones sealed under the capital, killed at birth if discovered. The code contains what appears to be a distinct Omen variant that is associated with flag data connected to Marika herself. Not to her children, to her directly. The internal naming conventions From Software use are not always literal, and there is genuine debate about what this actually means. But one possible reading is that there was, at some point in development, a more explicit connection between Marika's body or her bloodline and the Omen curse than what the final game shows you. The game as shipped implies it. The code, some researchers argue, may have once stated it outright. This matters because of what the Omen curse actually is, or what the game suggests it is. The Elden Ring lore points toward the Omen as beings who were never properly filtered through the Golden Order's framework. They retained something raw, something pre-order. The horns are not deformities in the traditional sense. They are described in item text as a manifestation of an inner nature that the Golden Order deemed unacceptable. When Morgott dies, he calls the Erd Tree his own. He calls it his. The Omen, the data suggests, may have a claim to the grace that the Golden Order's human legible system of blessing was designed to suppress and replace. If Marika herself had a direct Omen association in an earlier build, that reframes her entire project. The Golden Order would not just be a system she helped construct, it would be a system she constructed, at least in part, to bury something about herself. Now here is where it gets stranger. There are dialogue trees in the code for Melina that were never used. Melina is already one of the most enigmatic characters in the game. She guides you, she sacrifices herself. In most endings, she returns in one of them with what the game presents as a threat. But in the unused dialogue, she references the Erd Tree in ways that suggest a more active and older relationship with it than her shipped lines convey. One fragment, and I want to be careful here because translation from internal data is never perfect, appears to position Melina not as someone born outside the Erd Tree's grace which is how she describes herself in the final game, but as someone expelled from it. That is a meaningful distinction. Outside suggests she was never part of it. Expelled suggests she was, and that something happened. There is also a flag in the code that appears to track whether the player has discovered certain information about Melina's origin before reaching a specific point in her questline. The flag exists. The condition it would trigger does not appear to be connected to anything in the shipped game. It is set up and left hanging. That kind of orphaned flag system is usually a remnant of a questline that was cut or significantly altered late in development. The implication, and again this is an interpretation, is that Melina's questline was once longer and that it once contained a revelation about her nature that the player could discover out of sequence, which would then change how subsequent scenes played out. What revelation? The code does not say directly, but the flag is grouped in the internal data structure near other flags associated with Rani's questline and with data connected to the two fingers, which is suggestive of something. Let's talk about the two fingers for a moment, because the code has some uncomfortable things to say about them. The two fingers in the game's world are presented as the mouthpieces of the greater will, the outer god whose influence is embedded in the Elden Ring and the Erd Tree. They communicate in a gesture-based language that only finger readers like Enya can interpret. They are positioned as sacred, authoritative. The institutions of the Round Table hold orbit them, and yet, in the internal data, the two fingers are categorized in a way that groups them with a classification the development team used for entities that are, and I am translating loosely here, described as vessels or containers rather than agents. The same classification appears in data associated with certain enemy types that are explicitly described in item lore as hollowed-out constructs, bodies maintained for a purpose rather than beings acting from their own will. This lines up with what the game hints at in certain item descriptions, that the two fingers may not be the source of the greater will's communication, so much as tools shaped for that communication. But the code takes it slightly further than the shipped text does, because the vessel classification in the internal data is also associated with a decay flag, a variable that in other contexts tracks the deterioration state of objects and enemies over time. The two fingers in the code appear to have been built with a decay system attached to them, one that, based on the flag structure, may have once been visible to the player under certain conditions. In the shipped game, the two fingers look ancient and withered, but static. They do not change, but the data suggests that at some point, From Software may have intended them to visibly deteriorate as the game progressed, which raises the question of what they were deteriorating toward, and what the player was supposed to understand from watching it happen. There is a related finding that involves the Erd Tree itself. The Erd Tree has internal state flags that go beyond what you see in the game. You know how the tree changes as the story progresses, how it burns, how the interior shifts. Those changes are all handled by visible scripted events. But in the data, there are additional state flags for the Erd Tree that are never triggered in the shipped game. Some of these flags appear to be connected to sequences where the Erd Tree's root systems, the ones that spread beneath the game world and are associated with the horrifying Scarlet Rot spread, and the underground civilizations, were intended to exhibit reactive behavior. Specifically, the flag data suggests that the roots were once planned to respond to player actions in the lands between, in ways that would have been visible on the surface. There are also internal notes, not accessible to players, but present in the raw data, that researchers have translated as references to the Erd Tree's root system having a feeding behavior. The language used is consistent with how the game describes the roots in certain item texts, particularly around the deep root depths and the formless mother's domain. But the flag system suggests this was once going to be more dynamic, more responsive, like the tree was going to be shown, in real time, as something that was consuming rather than just existing. The reason this was likely cut is probably technical. Implementing a reactive overworld system of that kind would be enormously expensive in terms of development resources. But the fact that it was once planned, and that the data scaffolding for it still exists, tells you something about the original vision for the Erd Tree. It was not meant to be a symbol in the background. It was meant to behave like a predator. Now I want to talk about Godwyn. Godwyn the Golden is one of the most tragic figures in Elden Ring, and also one of the most misunderstood, partly because the game gives you his story in fragments scattered across item descriptions and geography, rather than in any linear way. He was the first to die in the Night of Black Knives, but the assassination was split in two. His soul was killed, not his body. And what remained, a body without a soul, became something the game calls the Prince of Death. The roots that spread beneath Stormvale, the death-touched ocean floor in the deep-root depths, the horrible proliferating fish-like growths, all of that is Godwyn. The code adds something to this that the shipped game only gestures at. There are internal flag structures associated with Godwyn's body that include a communication variable, not a dialogue flag, a communication variable, the kind the game uses for entities that have the capacity to transmit information to other entities. In the shipped game, Godwyn does not communicate. He is a body, a spreading mass. He is depicted as something that has lost any coherent selfhood. But the data suggests that at some point, From Software was building toward Godwyn's body, having some form of residual transmission. Something it was sending out into the world. This connects to something else. The data miners who found the Fear questline, which involves Godwyn, have noted that there are additional flag states for Fear's ending that appear to lead to an interaction that was cut. In the shipped game, Fear receives Godwyn's remembrance and uses it to create a mending rune. The ending she enables is melancholic, but relatively contained. But the unused flags suggest that there was once an additional step in which Fear would receive something back from Godwyn's body, not the remembrance, something the body was generating. The flag structure groups this near data associated with the outer gods, the beings like the Greater Will and the Formless Mother who exist outside the world and extend their influence into it. The implication, and this is one of the more disturbing readings in all of the data mining work I looked at for this video, is that Godwyn's soulless body was at some point in development going to be revealed as an active site of outer god incursion. Not just a tragic consequence of the Night of Black Knives, but a deliberate outcome of it, something that one of the outer gods wanted. A body without a soul, proliferating endlessly, the death curse spreading through the roots, becoming a kind of anchor point for something trying to enter the world. The shipped game implies this, if you read between the lines. The data suggests it was once going to be explicit. Let's shift to something that involves the player character more directly. The Tarnished. Your character has internal data flags that are more extensive than you would expect for what appears to be a blank slate protagonist. Most of the Tarnished's flags are what you would expect. Quest states, inventory trackers, death counters, location variables. But there is a set of flags in the data that researchers have grouped under what they call the Grace Contamination Cluster. And this is one of the findings that I kept coming back to while putting this video together. In the game's framework, Grace is the guiding light that leads the Tarnished through the lands between. It shows up as golden light streaming towards sites of grace. It restores you when you rest. It is presented as a gift from the Erd Tree, and by extension from Marika and the Greater Will. It is framed as benevolent, the thing that distinguishes you as a Tarnished from the hollowed and broken figures you fight throughout the game. But in the internal data, the Grace flags for the player character are built on the same foundational variable type as the flags used to track the influence of the outer gods on NPCs and enemies who are under their sway. The Omen flags, the Rot flags, the influence markers attached to Mohg's followers, and the servants of the Formless Mother. Structurally, in the code, the grace that guides you is built the same way as the influence that corrupts them. This could be a development shortcut. It is possible that From Software simply reused a variable type across multiple systems because it was convenient. But it is also consistent with something the game's lore keeps returning to, which is the question of whether the Tarnished's guidance is genuinely free, or whether it is a more sophisticated version of the same puppeting that the other outer gods perform on their servants. The two fingers guide you toward the Elden Throne. The Formless Mother drives Mohg toward his own version of a new age. The structural similarity in the code does not prove they are the same thing. but it suggests the question was, at minimum, on the development team's mind. There is also a flag in the Grace cluster that appears to track something the game internally labels as accumulation, the variable increments. It goes up over time, or possibly based on actions taken. In the shipped game, there is no visible effect connected to it. It accumulates, and nothing happens. But the flag exists in a group near data associated with late-game revelation sequences, the kind attached to questlines like Rani's and Fears, where the player learns something that reframes earlier events. The most straightforward interpretation of an accumulating grace flag near revelation sequence data is that it was once going to power a discovery, that the more the player progressed, the more grace they accumulated, the more something was going to become visible or unlockable, something about what the grace actually was. That content, whatever it was, is not in the shipped game. Now let's get into the Rune of Death, because the code has a lot to say about it, and most of it is troubling. The Rune of Death is the concept that death, actual true death rather than the endless resurrection the Golden Order maintains, was removed from the Elden Ring at some point in the history the game describes. Marika did this. She excised the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring, gave part of it to Maliketh to be sealed and guarded, and in doing so, fundamentally changed what death meant in the lands between. Under the Golden Order, the dead return to the Erd Tree. They are recycled. Their souls re-enter the world. True death, the kind that ends a soul permanently, was taken off the table. The code adds texture to this that the shipped game only partially conveys. There are internal data structures associated with the Rune of Death that include what researchers describe as a suppression stack, a system that tracks how thoroughly the rune's effect is being contained at any given point. This suppression stack has multiple levels, and the flags associated with those levels are connected to events throughout the game's timeline, both the backstory and the present-day events of the game itself. The Knight of Black Knives, which used blades anointed with destined death, moved the stack. Malikith's eventual defeat moves it. The game, as shipped, treats the return of destined death as a threshold event, but the suppression stack suggests that it was once going to be portrayed as a gradual process, with intermediate states that had their own effects on the world and on the tarnished's experience of it. Some researchers have connected this to the orphaned NPC dialogue mentioned earlier. If destined death was returning gradually rather than all at once, then certain characters who were benefiting from the Golden Order's suppression of true death would have had reason to react to that process in stages. The flag architecture supports this. The NPC dialogue fragments support it. The shipped game collapsed what may have been an extended mechanical and narrative arc into a single boss fight and its aftermath. What makes the suppression stack disturbing is one of its upper-end values. Most of the stack's levels are connected to things you would expect: events in the world, story beats, the death of major characters. But the highest level of the stack, the state that represents maximum suppression of the Rune of Death, is associated in the data with a flag cluster connected to the Tarnished's own resurrection system, the mechanic that lets you come back after dying, your ability to respawn. In the code, your resurrection system and the maximum suppression of destined death are linked. They share flag infrastructure. One reading of this is simply that your immortality is a product of the Golden Order's death suppression, which the game does imply, but the stack architecture suggests something more specific. It suggests that your respawning was once going to be portrayed not as a passive benefit of the Golden Order's existence, but as an active draw on the Rune of Death's suppression, that every time you came back from death, you were doing something to that stack, using it, depleting it in some small way, and that over the course of the game, across hundreds of deaths for most players, that depletion was going to matter. The content that would have made that matter, the system that would have tracked it and produced consequences, is not in the shipped game. The flag is there, the connection is there, the consequences are not. Let's talk about Malenia. Malenia is the character most players think they understand, the hardest boss in the game, the Blade of Miquella, the one who fought Radahn to a standstill and unleashed the scarlet rot that created Caelid. Her lore is more visible than most, but the code has details about her that shift the picture in unsettling ways. There is internal data associated with Millennia's boss encounter that includes a flag for a third phase. The shipped game has two phases. Phase 1 is Millennia the warrior. Phase 2 is Millennia the goddess. Transformed, the rot in bloom. The flag for a third phase exists in the data. It has a trigger condition and it has associated animation data. The trigger condition is connected to a flag for the death of Miquella. In the shipped game, Miquella is absent. He is the unalloyed gold needle. He is the Halic tree. He is the cocoon in Mogwin Palace. He is never encountered as a character who acts or speaks or dies. But in the data, there is a state for Miquella's death, with a variable that can be set, and that variable is connected to Millennia's third phase trigger. The implication is that there was once a version of the game in which Miquella died, or could die, before you reached Millennia, and that this death would push her into a state beyond what the shipped game shows you. What would that third phase have looked like? The animation data associated with it is incomplete. Researchers have described it as a collection of partial rigs, enough to suggest a direction but not enough to reconstruct the full intended form. What can be identified is that the third phase model data pulls from the same asset pool as the Scarlet Rot environmental effects, and also from asset pools associated with the outer god that is the source of the rot. The implication is that a grief-mad Millennia, Miquella dead, would have become something more completely possessed, something where the distinction between Millennia and the rot god would have broken down entirely. That is the version of the fight that got cut. There is also something in Millennia's data that connects back to the Omen discussion from earlier. Her internal classification data groups her with a set of characters who have what the development team labelled a dual nature flag. The characters in this group are ones who contain within them something that the Golden Order would consider anathema. Mog is in this group. Moggot is in this group. Both are omens. Millennia is in this group, which makes sense given that the Scarlet Rot is clearly at odds with the Golden Order's framework. But there is also a fifth character in this group whose identity researchers have debated extensively. The flag data does not include a name. It includes a size variable, an internal model scale reference, that is significantly larger than any of the named characters in the group. No one has definitively identified what that fifth entry refers to. Some researchers argue it is a remnant from a scrapped character. Others argue it could refer to an entity rather than a character, the outer god of rot itself in some partially embodied form. The flag architecture is not conclusive, but it sits there in the data, a fifth member of a group that includes two omen demigods, the rot-marked shard-bearing warrior, and her brother who was being groomed as a potential god. And it is larger than all of them. Now I want to spend some time on the underground, because the code for what is below the lands between is some of the most unsettling in the entire dataset. The lands between as a surface world sits on top of an elaborate underground system, the Siofra River, the Ainsel River, the deep-root depths, the Lake of Rot, the Mogwin Palace with its blood-soaked underground plain. These are not just levels. The lore positions them as layers of a different history, a pre-Erd Tree civilization, the domain of the Erd Tree's roots, the staging ground for outer god incursions. The game shows you a lot. The code suggests it was once going to show you more. There are map regions in the data that are partially constructed but not accessible in the shipped game. Researchers have identified what appears to be an additional underground layer beneath the deep-root depths. The geometry data for this layer is incomplete, but it is present. Associated with it are flag connections to the formless mother questline content that was cut, and to the Godwin communication flags discussed earlier. This layer, whatever it was going to be, appears to have been positioned as the deepest accessible point in the game's world, beneath even the subterranean root systems. There is also NPC data associated with this unreachable area. Not full NPC builds with complete dialogue trees, but flag markers that indicate characters were intended to appear there. One of these markers is associated with an NPC classification type the development team used for characters that are significantly ancient. Figures like the Erd Tree burial watchdogs and the Crucible Knights, who are described as remnants of an earlier age of the world. The marker in the unreachable underground area is associated with that ancient classification, but it also has a flag connecting it to Marika's own internal data cluster. This is the deepest layer of the suggestion I have been building towards throughout this video. Marika's data cluster in the code contains references and flag connections that appear throughout the game's systems, in ways that are disproportionate to her role as a figure you mostly encounter through statues and cutscenes. Her flags touch the Omen data, they touch the Melina data. There is a character type flag associated with her that is distinct from the demigod classification used for her children, and also distinct from the human classification and from the outer god entity classification. It is its own category, and the only other entry in that category in the internal data is the flag marker for the ancient NPC in the unreachable underground zone. 2 entries in a custom character category, Marika and something old beneath the earth that the game never shows you. What would have been down there? The data does not say clearly, but the flag architecture connects it to the pre-Erd tree history the game alludes to. The time before the Golden Order, when the Crucible governed life and death, and the world operated on different rules, and the connection to Marika suggests that whatever was in that space, it would have told you something about her origin, something that would have changed how her project, the Golden Order, the Erd tree, the whole structure of the world you spend the game navigating. Looked in retrospect, that content was cut. The flags remain. Let's talk about the Frenzied Flame, because its code is alarming in ways that are separate from its in-game presentation. The Frenzied Flame ending is the one where the player absorbs the flame of chaos hidden beneath the subterranean shunning grounds, becoming the Lord of Chaos and burning away the Erd tree, the Golden Order, and eventually all life and distinction in the lands between. It is presented as the most nihilistic of the endings, the one that most purely represents destruction. Hieta, who guides you toward it, describes it as liberation, as the undoing of the prison of separation that consciousness imposes on existence. The code for the Frenzied Flame system is extensive and in places contradicts the framing the shipped game uses. Specifically, there are internal documents associated with the Frenzied Flame that use the word inheritance rather than corruption. In most of the game's systems, acquiring influence from an outer god is framed in the data as corruption. The rot corrupts, the formless mother's influence corrupts. Even the influence of the greater will, in certain data contexts, is framed as an imposition. But the Frenzied Flame flags use inheritance. The player does not become corrupted by the 3 fingers, the player inherits from them. Researchers have pointed out that this is consistent with certain readings of the in-game text, which suggest that the Frenzied Flame predates the greater will's influence in the lands between, and represents something more foundational about the world's nature. But the inheritance framing in the code takes it further, because inheritance in the game's internal data is also used for the transfer of demigod powers through remembrances, and for the passing of the Elden Ring's runes between Marika's children. It is language used for legitimate succession, not for corruption or possession. There is also a flag in the Frenzied Flame cluster that tracks something the data labels as residual form. This flag is present in the Frenzied Flame ending sequence, but is not visibly used. It appears to be set but never read by any game system that produces an output the player can see. Residual form in other contexts in the game refers to the persistence of an entity's essential nature through transformation or death. The implication of a residual form flag in the Frenzied Flame ending that is set but never output is that there was once a version of that ending in which the player's identity, or something about the player character, persisted through the burning, that the Lord of Chaos was not a complete replacement of the tarnished, but a continuation of them. The shipped ending presents the Frenzied Flame as a consuming transformation. The data suggests it was once going to be portrayed as something that retains something of you, which changes, whether it is destruction or whether it is something more ambiguous. Connected to this is the cut content around Hieta. Her questline in the shipped game positions her as a guide, someone who leads you toward the 3 fingers and the Frenzied Flame. While operating on a kind of faith, she does not fully understand what she is guiding you toward and describes her visions in fragmentary terms. The code contains additional dialogue for Hieta that was not used, and some of it is among the more disturbing text in the entire dataset. In the unused dialogue, Hieta describes having seen through her visions an event she calls the first grace, not the Erd Tree's grace. Something earlier, she describes it in terms that researchers have connected to the crucible, the primordial energy that predates the Golden Order, and that the game associates with dragon communion and the oldest forms of life. She also describes this first grace as having been divided, as having been broken apart and distributed, with one portion becoming what the greater will uses to guide the tarnished, and another portion becoming what the three fingers contain. This is not in the shipped game. If you take it as an intended piece of the lore rather than a discarded idea, it suggests that the grace guiding you and the flame you can choose to inherit are the same thing at their root, divided, set in opposition, with the Erd Tree and the three fingers as two institutions built on either side of a split that happened before either of them existed. That reading would reframe every choice in the game. It would mean that the most destructive ending and the most restorative ending are drawing from the same original source. The code suggests this was once going to be part of the story. Let me talk about the demigods as a group now, because when you look at their internal data collectively, rather than individually, patterns emerge that the game does not foreground. The demigods in Elden Ring, Godwyn, Renala's children Radahn and Ranni and Rykard, and Marika and Godfrey's children Morgott, and Moog and Malenia and Mikella are all treated as individual narratives in the shipped game. Each has their own questline, their own remembrance, their own arc, but in the code, they share a flag cluster that the development team labelled, and this is a direct translation, the Shard Burden System. The Shard Burden System is a set of flags that track for each demigod the cost of holding their great rune. In the shipped game, the great runes are powerful items the player can equip and that provide stat bonuses. Lore-wise, they are fragments of the Elden Ring, and the game implies that holding them is significant. But in the shipped game, there is no visible mechanical cost. The demigods hold them. You take them. You can equip them for buffs. The Shard Burden System in the code suggests that it was once far more than that. The flags track a deterioration variable for each demigod tied to their great rune, with the variable increasing over time in ways that are connected to the demigod's in-world behaviour and appearance. Margit and Morgott's erratic behaviour, Rykard's consumption of his own soldiers, Radahn's war against the stars, and his eventual deterioration into a feral state, Moog's increasingly extreme blood rituals. The Shard Burden System flags are present for all of these deteriorations. The implication is that the game once intended the demigods unravelling to be framed explicitly as a consequence of holding the rune fragments, that the act of carrying a piece of the broken Elden Ring was destroying them in a way that the player was going to be able to observe and track. This would have made the player's act of taking the great runes ethically complex in a way the shipped game does not pursue. You are not just defeating powerful enemies and taking their power. You are ending something that was suffering under its weight. Or you are taking a burden that, based on the grace contamination data discussed earlier, you may not be as protected from as you assume. There is one more flag in the Shard Burden System that applies not to the demigods, but to the Elden Ring itself, or rather, to the ring's absence. The broken Elden Ring, the state the world is in when the game begins, has its own burden variable in the code. And unlike the demigod variables which track deterioration, the Elden Ring's burden variable tracks something labelled as overflow. The shard burden flags for the demigods appear to represent contained deterioration. The Elden Ring's flag appears to represent what happens when the burdens have nowhere to go, when the vessel is shattered and the weight spills out into the world, the lands between. As you experience it, the rot, the war, the madness, the collapsing institutions, the figures who were once great and are now broken versions of themselves, is in this reading not the aftermath of the Elden Ring's shattering, it is the shattering's contents, dispersed. The world you move through is made of what was once held inside. Let's come back to Ranni, because her questline has always been the one most players identify as the most complete and the most willing to engage with the deeper cosmological questions. And the code has things to say about her that suggest even her questline, the most intact of all of them, was significantly altered. Rani's project is to kill the Two Fingers, remove the influence of the greater will from the lands between, and create an age of stars, a future characterized by distance and cold, and a kind of cosmic freedom from the guiding influence of outer gods. The shipped game presents this as the most intellectually coherent of the major ending paths. Rani has thought it through. She has been executing her plan across centuries. She knows what she is trading away. The code contains a set of flags for Rani's questline that tracks something the internal data calls the distance accumulation. This is separate from the normal quest progression flags. It increments as the player moves through the Age of Stars ending content, and the entity whose data it is connected to is not Rani. The distance accumulation flags for Rani's ending connect, in the code, to the flag cluster associated with the Snow Witch. The Snow Witch is the teacher Rani bonded with in childhood, the figure she emulated, the source of her cold sorceries. In the shipped game, the Snow Witch is a historical figure, present as an item set and a reference in dialogue. She is not a present-day actor, but the distance accumulation flags are structured as if the Snow Witch is doing something in response to the events of Rani's questline, accumulating distance, moving away from something. The most coherent interpretation researchers have offered is that there was once a more explicit relationship between the Snow Witch and the Age of Stars, perhaps that the Snow Witch was connected to the outer god or cosmic entity that the Age of Stars is meant to bring into alignment with the lands between, the distant, cold thing that Rani is orienting the world toward, and that the questline once made this explicit in a way that would have complicated Rani's presentation as an unambiguous good. Because if the Age of Stars is a new outer god influence replacing the greater wills, then Rani's project is not freedom from that kind of influence. It is a transfer of it. The shipped game implies this is possible if you read critically. The code suggests it was once going to be part of the stated story. There is also a flag for Rani that the data labels as the true body variable. In the shipped game, Rani has a doll body. Her soul inhabits a puppet. She killed her original flesh body on the Night of Black Knives as part of her plan to escape fate. The true body variable in the code tracks a state that is neither the flesh body, which is dead, nor the doll body, which is present. It is a third state, and it is connected in the flag architecture to the Snow Witch data and to the Age of Stars ending flags. One reading, Rani's true body, in whatever sense the code uses that term, comes into existence or becomes accessible through the completion of her plan. The Age of Stars is not just a new cosmic order. It is also, for Rani specifically, a resurrection into something that is neither her old mortality nor her current puppet existence. The shipped game's final scene with Rani, where she appears on the moon and the two of you go off into the stars, could be read as gesturing at this. But the code suggests it was once going to be more explicit, that Rani's personal transformation and the transformation of the world were going to be presented as one event. I want to spend the final part of this video on something that is less about specific cut content and more about a structural finding that researchers have flagged as one of the most unusual features of Elden Ring's code. Throughout the game, there is a system that tracks what might be called the coherence of the world. This is not an official term. It is a description of what the flag cluster appears to do based on its connections and behavior. The coherence system monitors the state of several fundamental things simultaneously: the Erd tree's integrity, the state of the Elden Ring's fragments, the number of demigods still living, the level of outer god influence active in the world, and the status of the Rune of Death's suppression. All of these variables feed into a central flag that maintains a running value. In the shipped game, this value never reaches certain thresholds. The game is structured so that the player's actions move it in one direction or another, but the extremes of the range are never hit. The coherence value stays in a zone where the world is broken but functional, deteriorated but navigable, The flag architecture for what happens at the extremes of the range is still in the code. At maximum coherence, which would represent a world where the Erd tree is fully intact, the ring is whole, all demigods are living, and outer god influence is suppressed, the flag connections lead to data researchers describe as the unborn state, content, associated with a world that has not yet experienced the shattering. Possibly a world before the game's story begins. There are partial asset references in this cluster, nothing usable, but suggestive of environments and NPC states that do not match anything in the shipped game. At minimum coherence, which would represent a world where the Erd tree has fallen, the ring fragments are scattered or destroyed, all demigods are dead, and every form of outer god influence is at maximum. The flag connections lead to something the internal data labels, with a term that researchers have translated as the outside, not the outside of a building or a region. In the context of the game's cosmology, outside refers to the space beyond the world, the domain of the outer gods, the place where the greater will exists and where the thing in the frenzied flame comes from. At minimum coherence, the code suggests, the world does not end, it opens. The frenzied flame ending approaches this. Some researchers argue it was once going to reach it, a world so thoroughly stripped of its internal organizing structures that it becomes continuous with the outside, may have been a planned state that was pulled back to the partial version represented by the shipped frenzied flame ending. What would the player have experienced if that threshold was reached? The data gives us nothing concrete. The asset references in the minimum coherence cluster, partial and non-reconstructible, but they pull from asset pools associated with the sky, not the sky above the lands between, but the deep sky, the star-filled void visible in the age of stars, ending and in the cosmological imagery associated with the outer gods. The minimum coherent state, the opened world, appears to have been going to look like the outside looking in. There is one final flag in the coherence system. It is separate from the min and max threshold clusters. It is attached to the player character's own data, and it tracks whether the tarnished has, over the course of the game, seen everything, whether every major piece of lore, every questline, every underground layer, every demigod, every ending path has been encountered. The flag is structured as a completionist variable, but it is connected to the coherence system rather than to any achievement or reward system. And the value it would push the coherence tracking toward, if it were ever fully satisfied, is neither maximum nor minimum. It pushes it toward a midpoint the data labels as understanding. In the shipped game, this flag accumulates and produces no output. No ending acknowledges it. No NPC responds to it. No item references it. It is there, connecting the act of seeing everything the game has to show you to a specific coherent state the world never reaches, and it does nothing visible. From Software built a flag for a player who sees the whole picture. They built a consequence for it, and then they shipped a game where that consequence never fires. You said, continue for an additional 8 hours the same way, continue for an additional 8 hours the same way. 1623 Claude responded, the question of why that flag exists, why it was built and connected and then left without an output, is one I kept returning to while putting this video together. The question of why that flag exists, why it was built and connected and then left without an output, is one I kept returning to while putting this video together. It is possible. It is a development artifact, a tracking variable someone built to test whether questline completion was being registered correctly, and then never removed. That is the mundane explanation. The more interesting possibility is that it was once the skeleton of something, a planned acknowledgement that a player who had seen everything would be in a different relationship with the world than one who had only seen part of it. That understanding was going to mean something in the mechanics of the game, not just in the player's head. That distinction between a game that tracks your knowledge and a game that responds to it is at the heart of a lot of what the code suggests about the version of Elden Ring that almost existed. The shipped game is already extraordinary, but the data points towards something that was once even more entangled, a world where what you knew changed what the world did back to you. Let's keep going, because there is significantly more. I want to start this next section by talking about something that is easy to overlook in the surface level lore, which is the nature of the lands between as a physical place. Most players treat it as a fantasy world with geography, mountains, swamps, ruins, dungeons, the usual. But the internal data for the lands between's map structure contains flag systems that are inconsistent with that reading. Specifically, the game's map is divided internally into what the development team called domain zones. These are not the same as the visible regions on the player-facing map. They are a layer beneath that, an internal categorization of the world space according to which governing power or metaphysical principle is dominant in that area. Most of these domain zone classifications are what you would expect. The capital and its surroundings are flagged under the Golden Order domain. Caelid is flagged under the Rot domain. Morgwyn Palace is flagged under the Formless Mother's domain. But there are domain zone classifications in the code that do not match any named faction or power in the shipped game. Two of them are particularly notable. The first is a domain zone classification that covers a surprisingly large portion of the map, including sections of Liurnia, the area around the Albinauric settlements, and a corridor that runs northeast toward the consecrated snowfield. This domain zone's internal label translates roughly as the unmade domain. Researchers have debated this translation, and some prefer the ungoverned domain. But the underlying word in the development team's internal nomenclature is associated elsewhere with things that are in a state of potential rather than completion, things that have not yet become what they are going to be. The second unaccounted domain zone covers a smaller area, but is more precisely located. It sits directly beneath the Erd tree's visible root system in the map data, occupying a space that in the game's geometry corresponds to the transition zone between the surface world and the underground. Not the underground itself, and not the surface, the layer in between. This domain zone's label translates as the prior domain, and it is connected in the flag architecture to the same crucible and pre-Erd tree history references that appear throughout the deeper cuts of the code. What do these domain zones mean? In the shipped game, nothing. They exist in the data, but produce no visible output. No enemy type is exclusively associated with them. No item description references them. No NPC dialogue acknowledges them. They are classifications applied to sections of the world that, in the shipped game, behave like their neighboring areas and carry no special mechanical significance. But domain zones in the code are not just labels. They are flag containers. And the flags inside these two unaccounted domain zones include references to NPC spawn systems, to environmental state changes, and to dialogue triggers. The infrastructure for those systems exists. The content that would have filled them does not appear to be in the shipped game. The unmade domain zone, which covers that corridor through Liurnia and into the consecrated snowfield, has NPC spawn flags that reference a character type the development team classified as a guide figure, the same classification used for Melina and for Hieta. There was a guide figure associated with the unmade domain. Their dialogue data is absent. Their model data, if it existed, is not identifiable in the current files, but the spawn flags are there, pointing at empty space along a path that cuts through some of the game's most lore-dense regions. The prior domain zone, the one between surface and underground, has environmental state flags that connect to the Erd tree's internal state data. Specifically, they connect to the state flags representing the Erd tree before the shattering, the period the game treats as a golden age that the player never sees directly. The prior domain zone appears to have been planned as a place where the pre-shattering Erd tree state would be somehow visible or accessible, not through a cutscene or item description, through the environment itself. I think about what that would have meant for a player who found it. Beneath the surface, between worlds, a zone where the thing the game mourns, the order that was lost before you arrived, would have been somehow present, not restored. Present, the way a wound still holds the shape of what made it. That content is not there, the domain zone is. Let's move to the Albinaurics, because their code is one of the most extensive areas of cut content in the game, and what it points toward is significant. The Albinaurics are artificial humans created by the alchemist Seluvis and others like him, though the exact origin varies between albinaric generations. The first generation are the frog-like figures. The second generation appear almost human. The game treats them as a persecuted minority, hunted by the Golden Order, collected by Moog for his rituals. Their lore is melancholic, and their questline involvement, primarily through Latenna and through Nephili Lux's arc, is relatively contained. The code tells a different story about their intended role. There is an internal data cluster associated with the Albinaurics that the development team labeled as the inheritance line, not the same inheritance language used for the frenzied flame, a different variable. This one uses a term associated with biological succession, with the passage of traits or essence from one generation to the next. The inheritance line flags track something across the two albinauric generations, a quality that the first generation possesses fully and the second generation possesses partially. And this quality is connected, in the flag architecture, to something the game associates with Miquella. Specifically, the inheritance line connects to the unalloyed gold system. Miquella's great project, the one the Halig tree represents, was the creation of an unalloyed gold needle that could remove outer god influence from a person or entity completely. The Millennia questline involves this. The game uses it as a mechanism for freeing individuals from the grip of the rot god and potentially other outer god influences. But in the internal data, the unalloyed gold system has connections to the albinauric inheritance line that the shipped game does not surface. The implication, based on the flag architecture, is that the albinaurics were once going to be revealed as either the source of the unalloyed gold concept or as the living proof of it, that the quality tracked by the inheritance line was a form of natural immunity to outer god influence, the thing Miquella spent centuries trying to synthesize artificially, present organically in the beings the Golden Order was hunting down and destroying. If this reading is correct, the persecution of the albinaurics is not just a background tragedy in the lore, it is the Golden Order actively eliminating the proof of concept for the one thing that could free individuals from its own foundational dependency on outer god influence. The greater will cannot guide you if you are naturally immune to outer god influence. The albinaurics would have been, in this reading, an existential threat to the entire system, simply by existing. There are also flags in the albinauric data cluster that connect to Moog in a way that is more complex than the shipped game presents. In the shipped game, Moog's collection of albinaurics for his rituals is presented as exploitation, a demigod using a vulnerable population as fuel for his blood cult's ambitions. And it is that, but the code contains a flag for the albinauric blood ritual that tracks something the internal data labels as recognition. The ritual, in the data, is not just consuming the albinaurics, it is interacting with the inheritance line quality, Moog's blood magic, the formless mother's influence, and the albinauric natural immunity flags are connected in the code in a way that suggests the ritual was once going to be revealed as Moog attempting to extract or replicate that quality for his own purposes. Whether he was succeeding or failing is not clear from the data, but the recognition flag suggests he knew what it was, and that he wanted it for something other than what the shipped game shows you. Let me talk about Godfrey now, because the first Elden Lord gets less analytical attention than he deserves, and the code has notable things to say about him. Godfrey is presented in the shipped game as a straightforward figure in the context of Elden Ring's Baroque cosmology. He was Marika's first consort. He led the wars that established the Golden Order's dominance. He was exiled when he lost his grace, stripped of his divine connection, and sent to wander with the Tarnished. He eventually becomes Hoara Lux, the chieftain identity he set aside when he became Elden Lord, and you fight him in the capital as one of the late-game bosses. His arc is about greatness, loss, and a return to something more primal. In the code, Godfrey has a flag cluster that connects him to the Crucible in ways that are more extensive than the shipped game indicates. The Crucible Knights, the ancient warriors who predate the Golden Order, have a reverence flag in their internal data that points to Godfrey, not to the Erd Tree, not to Marika, to Godfrey specifically. In the shipped game, The connection between Godfrey and the Crucible is implicit. He wears Crucible-adjacent aesthetics. His lion companion Serosh is a creature associated with ancient, pre-Golden Order power. But the Reverence flag in the Crucible Knight data suggests this connection was once going to be made explicit, that the Crucible Knight's loyalty was going to be revealed as personal loyalty to Godfrey, rather than institutional loyalty to whatever power he happened to serve. This is significant because of what it implies about the Golden Order's founding. If the Crucible Knights follow Godfrey personally, then when Marika exiled Godfrey, she did not just remove her consort, she separated the ancient military order from its actual allegiance. The Crucible Knights who remained in the lands between, after Godfrey's exile, would have been in a position the code's flag structure hints at, but the game never states directly, loyal to a man who was gone, serving a system he had built, but that had now discarded him. There are unused dialogue flags for the Crucible Knight enemies that include a state variable the development team labeled as the waiting posture. In the shipped game, Crucible Knights are hostile enemies you fight, but the waiting posture flag suggests a non-hostile state. One, the code connects to the recognition of something the internal data calls a returning signal. The returning signal flag in the Crucible Knight data is architecturally connected to Godfrey's own internal data cluster, the Crucible Knights and the lands between. In what appears to have been an earlier build of the game, were going to recognize Godfrey when he returned, and their recognition of him, the returning signal, was going to shift their behavior. In the shipped game, Godfrey arrives at the Erd Tree, and you fight him as a boss. The ancient soldiers who predate the Golden Order are hostile. The connection is gestured at through aesthetics and lore implication. The code suggests it was once going to be a live interaction with the game's oldest military figures, shifting their allegiance back to their original lord in a way the player could witness, and that would have changed the texture of the final act significantly. There is also a flag in Godfrey's data that connects to Marika in a way that goes beyond their historical relationship as consorts. It is a flag the internal data labels as the anchor connection in the game's cosmological framework. Anchors are entities or locations that stabilize the metaphysical structure of the world. The Erd Tree is the primary anchor for the current age. The Elden Ring is the anchor for the laws governing life and death. The anchor connection flag between Godfrey and Marika suggests that their relationship was once going to be framed in explicitly cosmological terms, not just political marriage and military partnership. An anchor pair, two entities whose connections stabilized the world in a way that their separation began to destabilize. This would reframe Godfrey's exile not as a personnel decision by Marika, the removal of a consort who had served his purpose, but as a deliberate act of world-breaking. The first step in whatever plan she had that required the shattering. Why would she break her own anchor connection? The code does not say, but the flag architecture connects the anchor connection dissolution to the same cluster of Marika data that includes the Omen reference from earlier and the reference to the ancient NPC in the unreachable underground zone. Marika's project, whatever it fully was, appears to have required breaking things that were fundamental to the world's stability. Godfrey was one of them. Let's talk about Radahn, because his code contains one of the findings that I found most genuinely affecting when I first encountered it. Radahn in the shipped game is a tragedy, the greatest warrior of his age, beloved by his soldiers, a student of gravity magic, learned specifically so that his enormous frame would not crush his beloved horse Leonard, infected by the scarlet rot during the battle against Melania, slowly losing his mind, holding the stars in place through sheer will, even as his consciousness erodes, waiting in Caelid in a state of feral deterioration until the festival of Radahn calls warriors to give him a worthy death. The code adds a layer to this that the game does not show you. There is an internal flag for Radahn that tracks what the development team labeled as the star correspondence. This flag is connected to the gravity magic system and to the astronomical data the game uses for celestial bodies. In the shipped game, Radahn holds the stars in place. That is the extent of the mechanic. When you defeat him, the stars move again, and one of them falls, and that falling star is what opens Nokron, which is relevant to Rani's questline. But the star correspondence flag in the code is not just tracking whether Radahn is holding the stars, it is tracking whether Radahn is aware of a specific star, whether he can perceive it, even in his deteriorated state. And the star this flag corresponds to is the same star that falls when he dies. The shipped game implies that Rani planned for Radahn's death to release that specific star. But the code suggests something additional, that Radahn knew which star he was holding. That even as his mind eroded, the gravity magic kept him tethered to that specific celestial body in a way that was not just mechanical, but perceptual. He could feel it, or something in him that persisted through the rot. There is an unused audio flag in Radahn's encounter data that corresponds to the star correspondence reaching a specific value, a threshold the internal data labels as recognition. In the shipped game, Radahn makes no coherent vocalizations. He roars, he screams, he makes sounds that are closer to an animal than a person. But this audio flag, which is set up but never triggered, would have played a specific audio event when the recognition threshold was reached. The audio asset it references is absent from the game files, suggesting it was cut before the final build. But the flag architecture for when it would have triggered is intact. The recognition threshold is reached when the player has done enough damage to Radahn to push him into his second phase, the moment when he launches himself from the sky in a meteor strike. In the shipped game, this is a dramatic combat shift. In the data, it is accompanied by a flag that registers his awareness of the falling star, the reading this supports, and it is one of the more quietly devastating pieces of the code I encountered, is that Radahn's final attack was not just desperation, it was oriented. He knew where the star was going. He had been holding it for so long that when he finally let go, he knew what he was releasing and roughly where it would fall. Whether that constitutes intention is unclear. Whether the mind that registered it was still Radahn in any meaningful sense is unclear. But the code tracked it as recognition, and that word matters. Now I want to spend time on the sorcery system, because the internal data for the game's magic reveals things about the history of knowledge in the lands between that the item descriptions only gesture at. The game has multiple schools of magic. Sorceries are primarily associated with the Academy of Raya Lucaria and with the stars, with cosmic observation and the application of knowledge derived from studying the heavens. Incantations are associated with the Golden Order and with the various outer god influences, faith-based magic channeled through religious systems. And then there are what the code calls the prior arts, a term that does not appear in the shipped game but that researchers use to describe a collection of ability types in the data that predate the current categorical framework. The prior arts flag cluster includes abilities associated with the Crucible, the Dragon Communion magic, the form-changing and early life manipulation that the game's oldest enemies use. But it also includes a category of ability that is not represented in the shipped game at all. The internal label for this category translates as the reading, and the flag architecture connects it to the glintstone system, the magical mineral medium through which sorcerers channel their power, and to the outer gods, and to the Elden Ring itself. The reading, as best researchers can reconstruct from the flag connections, was a form of perception, not combat magic, not utility magic. The ability to directly perceive the underlying structure of the game's cosmological framework, to see the outer god's influence as a visible phenomenon, to perceive the state of the Elden Ring's fragments, to observe the metaphysical geography of the world in the way that the game allows you to see the physical geography. This category of magic was cut. No spells associated with it exist in the shipped game. But the flag architecture for what it would have done is present, and it connects to nearly every major system in the game. The reading flags interface with the domain zone data, with the coherent system, with the outer god influence trackers, with the shard burden system. If it had been implemented, it would have been a mechanic through which players could directly observe many of the systems I have been describing in this video. The hidden architecture of the world would not just have been in the code, it would have been in the game. The fact that it was cut means the game's hidden architecture remains hidden. The mechanic that would have made it visible was removed. What remains is what I have been describing for the past several hours. Infrastructure for a perception system installed in the game that ended up not allowing you to use it. There is an NPC associated with the reading magic in the data, a character whose internal classification is consistent with a merchant or teacher figure, someone who would have provided access to this ability type. The flag connections for this NPC point toward Raya Lucaria, the academy where sorcery is taught, and also toward the Church of the Cuckoo, the Renala-adjacent religious institution associated with the moon and with sorcerous knowledge. The NPC's dialogue data is absent, their model data is absent, but the spawn flag places them in a location that, in the shipped game, contains only a minor enemy camp and a site of grace. What would they have told you? Given the flag connections, possibly everything. The reading mechanic, fully implemented, would have made a player who used it into someone who could see the world the way the code sees it. The NPC who would have taught it would have been, in effect, a character who handed you the tools to understand what the game was actually about. That character does not exist in the shipped game. The location where they would have stood is empty. Let's talk about the volcano manor, because the internal data for the manor and for Rykard's questline contains some of the more disturbing structural findings in the code, and also points toward a version of the game where one of the major late-game areas was significantly different. Rykard, in the shipped game, is the demigod who chose a specific form of transgression, feeding himself to the god-devouring serpent, merging with it, becoming a composite entity whose explicit goal is to devour the gods. His questline through the Volcano Manor involves becoming an assassin for the Manor's covenant, killing Tarnished who are trying to reach the Erd Tree before the Manor eventually lets you into Rykard's chamber. The lore frames this as nihilistic, and also, depending on how you read Rykard, possibly as the most honest response to the Golden Order's violence. He decided to eat the system rather than serve it. The code for Rykard contains a flag cluster that the development team labelled as the consumption progression. This is analogous to, but distinct from the shard burden system discussed earlier. The shard burden tracked the deterioration caused by holding a great rune. The consumption progression tracks something different. It tracks the degree to which the serpent and Rykard are unified, the completeness of the merger. In the shipped game, when you encounter Rykard, he is fully merged. He is the god-devouring serpent, and he is Rykard, and the two things are the same entity speaking with two voices. But the consumption progression flag has multiple intermediate states, and the shipped game appears to place you at the end of a process that was once going to be more visible throughout the game's timeline. Specifically, the earlier states of the consumption progression are connected to NPC behavior flags for characters in Volcano Manor. The Manor's inhabitants, Tanith and her knights, have internal data connections to the consumption progression that suggest their loyalty and their behavior were once going to visibly shift as the merger progressed. In the shipped game, Tanith's devotion to Rykard is consistent throughout. She grieves after his death and, in one of the game's more unsettling post-boss moments, eats his remains. But the flag connections suggest that her behavior in the manor was once going to be more obviously responsive to the state of Rykard's merger, that the manor as a place was going to feel increasingly consumed as the game progressed, in a way the player could observe. There is also a flag in the consumption progression data that connects to the Erd Tree, specifically to the Erd Tree's structural integrity flags. The relationship is architectural rather than causal in the code, meaning the flag does not suggest that Rykard's consumption is directly damaging the Erd Tree, but rather that the two systems were being monitored together, as if the development team was tracking a relationship between Rykard's transgression and the Erd Tree's health in parallel. What that relationship was going to mean for the player is not apparent from the data alone, but the parallel tracking suggests it was intentional, that there was something the two systems were meant to illuminate about each other. One possible reading: the god-devouring serpent's consumption of a demigod who held a great rune was going to have a visible effect on the Erd Tree, a feeding in one direction reflected in the other. Rykard eating the system from below, the Erd Tree state registering the wound. Let me move to something that I have been building toward. which is the internal data for the endings themselves. The shipped game has 6 major endings: Elden Lord, Age of Stars, Lord of Frenzied Flame, Dung Eater's Blessing of Despair, Fear's Age of Duskborn, and the Gold Mask's Perfect Order. Each of these is attached to a mending rune or equivalent, a way of repairing the Elden Ring that reflects the values or worldview of the character associated with it. The variety of endings is one of the things players most appreciate about Elden Ring. The sense that the world's future is genuinely undetermined and that different answers to its problems are possible. The code contains scaffolding for additional endings that are not in the shipped game. Some of these are well documented in the data mining community, others are less discussed. The most extensively scaffolded cut ending is the one researchers call the Erd-tree zone. The flag architecture for this ending connects to Morgott's questline, to the omen lore discussed earlier, and to the internal Marika data cluster. In the shipped game, Morgott is the guardian of the Erd-tree, the Omen Prince who, despite being everything the Golden Order despises, devoted himself completely to protecting the system that would destroy him, if it could. His death is one of the most melancholic moments in the game. He dies defending something that never accepted him. The Erd-tree's own ending, in the data, appears to have been built around a mending rune or equivalent that was associated with Morgott. The flag connections suggest an ending in which the omen's claim to the Erd-tree, the thing Morgott seems to genuinely feel when he calls it his own in his death dialogue, was going to be honoured. An age in which the Erd-tree's grace was extended to those the Golden Order excluded. An ending in which the system was not remade according to any external philosophy, but according to what the Erd-tree, freed from the Golden Order's interpretive framework, might actually want. The mending rune, or equivalent for this ending, does not exist in the shipped game. Morgott has no questline that extends past his role as a boss, but the flag infrastructure for what would have preceded and followed this ending is present in the data, including connections to the Omen NPC data discussed earlier, and to the domain zone data for the subterranean shunning grounds, the underground space where the Golden Order imprisoned its Omen children. Another scaffolded cut ending is less redemptive in its framing. Researchers call it the Outer God's Throne. The flag architecture for this ending connects to the Outer God influence trackers and to the player character's grace contamination flags. In this ending, rather than mending the Elden Ring with a philosophy or remaking the world according to a particular value, the player would have become something more directly. Not a lord who channels an outer god's influence, as the various shipped endings effectively are, but a direct vessel for one. The distinction in the data is the same distinction discussed earlier when talking about the two fingers. Not an agent, a container. The Outer God's Throne ending appears to have been the endpoint of a questline that involved accumulating Outer God influence from multiple sources throughout the game. The Grace Contamination flags, the Rot flags, the Blood Cult flags, the Frenzied Flame flags. If a player had pursued all of them simultaneously, allowing all forms of Outer God influence to accumulate rather than committing to one, the threshold value reached would have triggered this ending. The world would not have been remade, it would have been occupied. The third scaffolded cut ending is the one I find most interesting. Researchers call it the Tarnished's Truth, and it connects directly to the completionist flag in the coherence system. This ending is associated with the understanding midpoint value, not the destruction of the outside at minimum coherence, and not the unborn state at maximum, a middle state that the data labels as a world that knows itself. The content for this ending is the most incomplete of the three scaffolded cuts. The flag connections are present, but many of the assets they reference are absent. What can be reconstructed is that this ending did not involve a mending rune. It did not involve remaking the world according to any philosophy or faction. It involved the Tarnished standing at the Elden Ring, having seen everything, having understood the architecture that this video has been describing, and doing something the internal data labels as the disclosure. What the disclosure would have looked like is not recoverable from the data. The asset references point to absent files, but the disclosure flag is connected to the coherence system, to the domain zone data, to the Outer God influence trackers, and to Marika's own data cluster. All of the systems that track what the world is and what is hidden beneath it. The disclosure, whatever it was, appears to have been a revelation directed not at the world, not at the other characters, but outward, through the fourth wall, if the game had chosen to break it, or towards something the data does not name but whose flag cluster sits adjacent to the player character's own data. The tarnished truth ending would have been a response to the hidden architecture, not mending it, not destroying it, naming it. There is something else in the code that I want to address before moving on, which is the internal data for the player character's death state, not the gameplay death, the respawn mechanic. The actual death state, the state the game would enter if the player character died in a way that was flagged as permanent, something the shipped game never actually allows, but that the code has infrastructure for. In the shipped game, death is a loop. You die, you lose your runes, you respawn at a site of grace. The cycle is intentional and meaningful within the lore. You are tarnished. The Erd Tree's grace sustains you through death. Your journey is defined by endless resurrection. But in the code, there is a permanent death flag with a trigger condition that is never met in the shipped game. The trigger condition connects to the Rune of Death suppression stack discussed earlier, specifically to the state of the stack when it is fully depleted. If the suppression stack ever reached zero, the permanent death flag could be triggered. In the shipped game, the stack never reaches zero. The game is designed to prevent it. But the permanent death flag is built. Its condition is defined, and what happens when it fires is present in the code. When the permanent death flag fires, the game does not end in the normal sense. It does not go to a game over screen. The flag connections lead to a specific environmental state change in the world, followed by a narrative event, followed by what the internal data labels as a succession protocol. The succession protocol is connected to the NPC flag systems and to the world state trackers. The permanent death of the tarnished was going to change the world, not end the game. Change the world, the NPCs whose fate was connected to the tarnished's journey would have shifted states. The world's trajectory, whatever the current quest flags indicated, would have updated according to a logic the code maintains but never executes. And a succession protocol suggests that something was going to be passed on, that the player character's role in the world was going to transfer to something else. What that something else was is not identifiable from the data alone. But the succession protocol flags connect to NPC data for several characters who in the shipped game are either dead by the late game or transformed beyond their original function. There is a reading in which the permanent death of the tarnished, in this cut system, would have activated the dormant potential of characters the player had encountered and possibly dismissed. People who were waiting for the protagonist to fail so that they could try. I want to spend some time now on the Night of Black Knives, because the event that set the game's story in motion has internal data attached to it that is more extensive than its role as backstory would suggest. The Night of Black Knives is the historical event in which Godwyn the Golden was murdered, his soul killed, but his body preserved, and in which Ranni simultaneously killed her own body to shed her fate, allowing her soul to persist in a different form. The blades used in the assassination were anointed with destined death, the rune of death extracted by someone from Malekith's keeping. The game implies, but does not confirm, that Ranni orchestrated both killings, her own and Godwyn's, with Marika's possible awareness or even assistance. The internal data for the Night of Black Knives is filed as a historical event, meaning it is information the current-day game accesses through memory items, NPC dialogue, and lore text, rather than through direct gameplay. But the flag architecture for the Night of Black Knives is not structured like a backstory element. It is structured like a live event. The flags have active monitoring states. They track whether the player has accumulated enough information about the night across all sources. They track which version of events the player has encountered. And they connect to a convergence flag that, when all the information is accumulated, is supposed to trigger something. The convergence flag for the Night of Black Knives is connected to Ranni's questline, which you would expect, but it is also connected to Marika's data cluster and to the Melina data and to a flag associated with an NPC who is present in the game, but who the shipped game never has deliver a revelation. The NPC is Enia, the finger reader at the round table hold. In the shipped game, Enia is a merchant figure who exchanges Great Rune remembrances for boss weapons. She is useful but peripheral, but in the code, she has a dialogue flag cluster that is among the largest for any non-questline NPC in the game, and a significant portion of it connects to the Knight of Black Knives convergence system. Enia, based on the flag architecture, was once going to be the character who told you what actually happened on the Knight of Black Knives, not through item descriptions, not through implication, directly. Her convergence dialogue, which exists as a flag structure without the dialogue content to fill it, was going to be triggered when the player had gathered enough information, and it was going to deliver a synthesis that the individual fragments do not allow the player to construct alone. What was in that dialogue? The content is absent, but the flags it connects to include the Marika Omen data, the Melina expelled flag, the Snow Witch distance accumulation, and the anchor connection between Marika and Godfrey. All of the things I have been describing in this video, Enia was the character who was going to gather those threads and tell you what they meant together. She still stands in the round table hold in the shipped game. She offers you weapons. The dialogue tree that would have made her the most important NPC in the game is a skeleton with no flesh on it. Let me talk about the Eternal Cities now, because Nokron and Nokstella and the underground civilizations have code that points toward a history of the world that is significantly darker than the game's surface presentation. The Eternal Cities are civilizations that existed before the Erdtree's dominance. They sought immortality through the stars. They were punished for it, their cities sent underground, or in the case of the city the Falling Star, destroyed, shattered. The game presents them as cautionary tales, proof of the danger of reaching beyond the Golden Order's framework for understanding life and death. But the code for the Eternal Cities contains flags that complicate the cautionary tale framing considerably. There is an internal flag system for the Eternal Cities that tracks what the development team labeled as the Star Correspondence Network, using the same phrase structure as the Radan Star Correspondence flag, but referring to a system rather than an individual. The network flags suggest that the Eternal Cities were not just studying the stars, they were in communication with something through the stars. Not receiving information passively, the way sorcerers use stellar observation, but exchanging a two-directional relationship with something the internal data associates with the same outer god categories used for the greater will and the formless mother. The game implies that the Eternal Cities' reach for immortality attracted the attention of the greater will, which punished them. But the Star Correspondence Network flags suggest a more complex relationship. They suggest the Eternal Cities had established contact with an outer god that was not the greater will, and that the greater will's punishment of the Eternal Cities was not just the enforcement of cosmic order, it was the elimination of a competing relationship. There are flags in the Eternal City data that connect to a specific outer god category, one that does not map cleanly to any named entity in the shipped game. Researchers call it the distant star entity. For consistency with the astronomical associations in the data, the distant star entity's flag cluster appears throughout the underground areas, not just in the Eternal Cities but in the older geological strata the game represents, in places like the Deep-Root Depths and the Lake of Rot. Its influence, in the data, predates the Greater Will's presence in the lands between, and its relationship with the Eternal Cities was, based on the network flags, mutual. The Eternal Cities' sin in this reading was not hubris, it was loyalty to a prior relationship. What happened to the distant star entity after the Greater Will's punishment of the Eternal Cities is not clearly delineated in the code, but the flag architecture has traces of it in places. The Nox people, the inhabitants of the Eternal Cities who survived and persist in the underground, have internal data connections to the distant star entity that are marked as dormant rather than severed. They still carry something of the relationship. It has not been ended, it has been suppressed. This connects to the unmade domain zone discussed earlier, the area of the surface world that has the guide figure spawn flag and that covers the path through Liurnia toward the consecrated snowfield. The unmade domain zone's internal flag data includes a connection to the Nox people's dormant relationship flags. There was a path in an earlier version of the game that connected the underground survivors of the Greater Will's punishment to a zone of the surface world that was itself outside the Golden Order's clear jurisdiction, a corridor between the suppressed and the ungoverned. What would have been along that corridor, who the guide figure would have been, what the unmade domain zone would have done when you reached it, none of that is in the data in a recoverable form, but the infrastructure for a path exists, connecting the underground civilization's ancient relationship with a pre-Greater Will cosmic entity to an unsanctioned zone of the surface world. With a guide to take you through it, let's talk about dragons, because the Dragon Covenant system and the Dragon Communion magic have internal data that points toward a role for dragons in the world that was significantly larger in an earlier build. In the shipped game, dragons are present in two primary modes: enemy dragons, scattered across the world, mostly hostile, representing the ancient power that predates the Golden Order, and the Dragon Communion Covenant, centered in the Cathedral of Dragon Communion, where you can exchange dragon hearts for incantations based on dragon abilities. The code for the Dragon Communion system has a depth that the shipped implementation does not use. There is an internal hierarchy in the dragon data, a classification system that distinguishes between different tiers of dragon consciousness and power. Most of the dragons you encounter in the world are classified at the lower tiers: ancient, but no longer fully aware. Placidusax, the boss in Pharaoh Mazula who was once the Elden Lord's dragon, is classified at a higher tier, and at the top of the hierarchy, in the code, is a category that no enemy or NPC in the shipped game is classified under. The top tier category in the dragon hierarchy is labeled as the primordial. The primordial classification is used in other contexts in the code to describe the earliest version of something, the form of an entity or principle, before it was modified or limited by the current age's organizing structures. A primordial dragon, based on the classification context, would be something older than the dragons you encounter in the world, something from before the Golden Order, before the Crucible even. The development team's implied timeline suggests a dragon that predates the categorization of living things into the forms the current age recognizes. There is an NPC spawn flag in the code that references the primordial classification. It is located in Pharaoh Mazula, the crumbling city outside time, where Malekith guards the Rune of Death, and where Placidus Sax waits. The spawn flag is near Placidus Sax's arena, but distinct from it, pointing at a location that in the shipped game contains environmental detail, but no character. The NPC, or entity, that this spawn flag references has no model data, no dialogue data, no associated quest flags in the shipped game. What it has is a classification flag, primordial, and a connection through the flag architecture to the pre-Golden Order history that runs through everything else in this video. Placidus Sax's lore states that he waits for a god who never returned. The game implies this was his Elden Lord, the god who existed before Marika held that position. The primordial spawn flag near his arena suggests there was once another entity associated with Pharaoh Mazula, something even older than Placidus Sax, something that was there before the god who left and did not return. What it was waiting for, if anything, is not in the data. There is also a dragon system flag that connects to the player character in a way that is easy to miss. The Dragon Communion incantations you can acquire have an internal accumulation tracker, separate from the number of spells you have unlocked. This tracker increments with each dragon heart you exchange, and it is connected, in the flag architecture, to the same dual nature classification system discussed in the context of Millennia, Moog, Morgut, and the unnamed fifth entry. At a threshold, the shipped game never explicitly marks. The dragon heart accumulation flag would push the player character's classification flags into the dual nature category. The tarnished, who has communed with enough dragons, would have been classified internally the same way the Omen demigods are classified, as someone containing something the Golden Order would consider anathema, the content that would have acknowledged this, quests that would have reacted to it, NPCs who would have treated you differently because of it is not in the shipped game, but the classification shift would have happened in the data. You can reach that threshold. The game just never tells you that you did. Now let me address something about Farum Azula itself, because the internal data for that location has one of the most unusual structural features in the entire codebase. Farum Azula is described as a city existing outside time. Its architecture is crumbling in mid-collapse, stones suspended in the air, the structure in a permanent state of falling without ever having fallen. The lore associates it with an ancient storm and with Maliketh and with the ancient dragons. It is visually one of the most striking areas in the game and conceptually one of the most interesting. A place where time does not function normally. The code for Farum Azula has a world state flag that is distinct from the state flags for any other area in the game. In every other area, the world state flags track things like whether you have defeated a boss, completed a quest, or triggered a specific event. The world state flags for Farum Azula track something the internal data calls temporal convergence, and unlike every other world state flag in the game, the Farum Azula temporal convergence flags have connections to every major timeline event in the game's history. Not just the present day of the story, everything. The Night of Black Knives, the Shattering, the Age Before the Erd Tree, the construction of the Golden Order, all of it is connected to Farum Azula's world state data. The most straightforward interpretation is that this reflects the narrative concept of the location, a place outside time that touches all moments. But the flag architecture goes further than concept. The temporal convergence flags for Farum Azula include active monitoring connections to the player character's discovery flags. The variables that track what lore items the player has read, what NPC conversations they have had, what questlines they have completed. Farum Azula, in the code, is watching what the player knows. And there is a response state. At a certain threshold of player discovery, the temporal convergence flags for Farum Azula shift to a different value. Not a new area loading. Not a boss appearing. The area itself would have changed state. What that state change would have looked like or done is represented in the code only as a flag shift, with no visible asset changes connected to it in the shipped game. The response to a sufficiently informed player from the one place in the world that exists outside time, and that the code connects to everything, was planned and is not implemented. There is also an entity flag in the Farum Azula data that sits separate from all the enemy and NPC classifications. It is not categorized as a character or an enemy or an object. It is classified as a presence. The presence flag for Farum Azula is connected to the temporal convergence system, to the Night of Black Knives history flags, and to the Outer God data clusters. In the shipped game, there is no entity that would be described as a presence in Farum Azula that cannot be explained by the existing content. Maliketh is there, the ancient dragons are there, the environment itself is there. The presence flag references something that is none of those things. Its connection to the Night of Black Knives flags and the Outer God data suggests something that is observing rather than participating, something that has been in Farum Azula, which exists outside time, watching the events the game's history describes, for as long as those events have been happening. The shipped game does not show it to you. Let me talk about the round table hold, because the code for that location is surprisingly dense and contains connections that the game's use of the space as a hub area obscures. In the shipped game, the round table hold is a meeting place for Tarnished, a space provided by the Two Fingers where champions gather between sorties into the lands between. It has a small cast of NPCs, some of whom have questlines, and it serves primarily as a narrative and mechanical hub. It feels like a lobby. The code for the round table hold treats it very differently. There is an internal data cluster for the hold that the development team labeled as the Covenant Chamber System. This system is distinct from the NPC quest flags and from the normal world state trackers. It is a monitoring system that tracks the accumulated knowledge, questline completion, and ideological orientation of the player character, and maps them against a set of faction classifications. The faction classifications in the Covenant Chamber system are more numerous than the factions the shipped game explicitly names. The Golden Order, the Rani faction, the Formless Mother's Servants, the Frenzied Flame Alignment, the Dragon Communion Practitioners. These are all present. But there are also faction classifications in the Covenant Chamber data that have no corresponding shipped game faction. One of these is labeled the Prior Covenant. Its connection in the flag architecture is to the Crucible data, to the pre-Golden Order history, and to the domain zones discussed earlier. The Prior Covenant faction classification was attached in the code to several NPCs, who in the shipped game are presented as neutral or unaffiliated. D, the Hunter of the Dead, is one of them. His questline in the shipped game is about the undead curse, and about his complicated relationship with his brother Darien. But in the Prior Covenant flag system, D is classified as a potential member of a faction that predates the current age, and that the current power structures would consider threatening. Another unnamed faction in the Covenant Chamber system is labelled as the Acknowledgement faction. The flag connections for this one are to the Coherence System's Understanding Midpoint, to the Completionist flag, and to the Cut Tarnished's Truth ending. The Acknowledgement faction was not ideological in the way the other factions are. It was not about serving a power or following a philosophy. It was about knowing. The faction a player would have been classified into simply by having seen enough. The Covenant Chamber system appears to have been the mechanism through which the Round Table Hold would have shifted its function based on the player's accumulated knowledge and alliances, not just as a hub area, but as a political space that reflected the player's position in the world. NPCs who were friendly when you knew little might have become wary. Factions that were hostile in the early game might have offered allegiance once you were classified within their framework. The shipped game's Round Table Hold has none of this. The NPCs do their quest lines, the space is stable, the Covenant Chamber system is there in the data, watching what kind of tarnished you are, and never saying anything about it. I want to address the Empyreans now, because the code for the characters designated as potential gods, Melania, Rani, and Miquella, has a shared data structure that points towards something the game discusses only obliquely. Empyrean is a term used in the game for a specific category of demigod, one who is considered a potential vessel for a new god. The existing god, Marika, was once Empyrean herself. The two fingers designate new Empyreans to continue the cycle. The shipped game identifies the three I named, and their shared destinies form much of the game's dramatic architecture. In the internal data, the Empyrean classification comes with a flag cluster that the development team labelled as the Vessel Protocol. The Vessel Protocol is analogous to, but distinct from the vessel classification assigned to the two fingers. Where the two fingers vessel classification frames them as containers for an external will, the Empyrean Vessel Protocol is structured differently. It tracks a bidirectional relationship, not just what the Empyrean contains, but what the Empyrean transmits. The Empyreans, in the code, are not just containers for divine power. They broadcast it. The Vessel Protocol flags for Melania, Rani, and Miquella each track a transmission output that is connected to the people around them. Melania's followers in the Halig tree, Rani's servants across her quest line, Miquella's devotees, the characters who loved him with what the game describes as a compelled love. The shipped game implies that Miquella's loved ones are under some form of compelled devotion, possibly a magical effect, possibly something about his grace, but the Vessel Protocol in the code makes the mechanism more explicit, framing it as a transmission, something the Empyrean broadcasts rather than something they intentionally cast. The devotion in the people around Miquella, and to a lesser extent in those near Melania and Rani, is an emission, a side effect of what the Empyrean vessel contains. This connects to a flag in the Vessel Protocol data, labelled as the unbounded state. In the shipped game, all three Empyreans are in some form of incomplete or compromised condition. Melania is fighting the outer god within her. Rani has separated her soul from her body and moved it into a doll, limiting her transmission. Miquella has sealed himself in a cocoon. These states, in the Vessel Protocol data, are all classified as bounded states, forms of self-limitation that reduce the transmission output. The unbounded state flag which none of the three Empyreans reach in the shipped game, represents the vessel protocol at full function. An Empyrean transmitting without restriction, the flag connections for the unbounded state lead to the same outer God category flags used throughout this video, suggesting that an unbounded Empyrean would be in a relationship with the cosmic forces around them that would be qualitatively different from anything the shipped game shows. What would an unbounded Makela have been? The cocoon suggests he was in the process of becoming something, using the isolation to complete a transformation. The vessel protocol flags suggest the transformation he was working toward was the unbounded state, the full expression of what an Empyrean vessel does, and the outer God connections. For that state suggests that reaching it would have drawn cosmic attention or constituted a kind of announcement to the forces that care about these things. The shipped game has Mog extract Makela from the cocoon before he completes whatever he was doing. The Makela you see is unresponsive. Still, the question of what would have happened if he had finished is left hanging. The vessel protocol flags suggest the development team once had a detailed answer for it. Let me address the fell god now, the outer god associated with fire and flame, because the code for fire-related content has a coherence that points toward a much more unified narrative presence for this entity than the shipped game delivers. The fell god is mentioned explicitly in the game in connection with the fire giants, the ancient enemies who maintain the flame of ruin at the mountaintops of the giants. Marika's forces destroyed the fire giants, leaving only one alive to maintain the flame, binding it as a precaution. The flame itself is the thing you light at the end of the standard ending path, burning the Erd tree to allow your ascension. In the shipped game, the fell god is a backstory reference, a defeated power, something the Golden Order overcame. The internal data for fire-related content is not structured like a defeated power. The fell god's flag cluster appears throughout the code in active states, not as a historical reference, but as a present influence. There are fire-related environmental flags in areas far from the mountaintops that connect to the fell god's data cluster. The fire in the volcano manor, the fires in the ruins scattered across the lands between. Even the Erd trees burning, when it happens, has a flag connection to the fell god's cluster. The most significant finding in the fell god data involves a flag the development team labeled as the Ember Persistence. This flag tracks the continued presence of the fell god's influence in the world despite the defeat of the fire giants. And the Ember Persistence flag is not a small residual tracker. It is connected to the same flag architecture used for active outer god influences throughout the game. The fell god, in the code, is not dormant. Something of it persists at a level the shipped game does not acknowledge. There is an NPC associated with the fell god's data that researchers have identified in the code as a non-hostile entity, not an enemy, a character. Their classification is consistent with a survivor or remnant type, similar to the classification used for characters like Deer and Gowry who are transformed or compromised, but still functional. The spawn flag for this character is located in the mountaintops of the giants, in an area that in the shipped game contains environmental content but no NPC. The NPC's flag connections include dialogue triggers connected to the fell god's Ember Persistence tracker and to the player character's fire-related action history. If you have done things associated with the Flame of Ruin, with the fire giants, with the volcano manor, this character's dialogue state would have shifted. They were going to respond to what you knew and what you had done in the fire-touched parts of the world. The Ember Persistence flags also connect to the Erd tree burning sequence and to the standard ending path. The implication, based on the architecture, is that lighting the Erd tree on fire was going to have a more explicitly acknowledged relationship with the fell god's ongoing presence, not just using the Flame of Ruin as a tool. Feeding something. The fire that burns the Erd tree and the fire that the fell god represents were going to be acknowledged as connected, and the NPC in the mountaintops was going to be the character who named that connection. Let's go deeper into what the code says about Marika, because I have been threading her through this entire video, and I want to address her directly now. Marika is the most structurally central character in the game. She is present everywhere in the physical world, as statues, as the bodies sealed inside the Erd Tree, as the divine authority that every faction either serves or rebels against. And yet, she is almost entirely absent as an acting character. You never have a real conversation with her. Her motivations are reconstructed through lore fragments. She is the center of everything, and you never actually reach her. The code for Marika has more depth than possibly any other character in the game, and most of it is not surfaced in the shipped product. There is an internal flag system for Marika, labeled as the Divine History, a complete timeline of her actions from her origin to the present day of the game's story. The Divine History flags track events in sequence, each building on the last, with connections to the other major events and characters throughout the game. Most of these flags are connected to things the game references in item descriptions and dialogue: the founding of the Golden Order, the marriage to Godfrey, the Night of Black Knives, the Shattering, but some of them are connected to events that the shipped game never names. There is a Divine History flag for an event that precedes the founding of the Golden Order, labeled as the Renunciation. The Renunciation flag connects to the Omen data, to the Prior Covenant faction from the Round Table Hold, and to the Prior Domain Zone in the Underground. It precedes all of the Golden Order's activities in the Divine History sequence. Marika, before she built the Golden Order, renounced something. The flag connections suggest it was a prior allegiance, something connected to the pre-order powers, the Crucible, the Prior Covenant, possibly the distant star entity from the Eternal City data. There is a Divine History flag for an event between the Night of Black Knives and the Shattering, labeled as the Preparation. This flag connects to Godwin's communications flags, to the Empyrean Vessel Protocol data, and to a set of flags associated with the Elden Ring's internal structure, the arrangement of the runes within it before the Shattering. Marika did something to prepare between her son's death and her shattering of the ring. The Preparation flag's connections suggest she was arranging conditions rather than grieving. The Shattering was not a breakdown. It was a conclusion to a preparation sequence. And there is a Divine History flag after the Shattering, labeled as the Wait, which connects to her current state, sealed within the Erd Tree, and to the player character's progression flags. Marika is waiting for something specific. In the shipped game, the implication is that she is waiting for a tarnish to arrive and mend the ring. But the Wait flag's connections are more specific than that. They connect to the Coherence System's understanding midpoint, to the Acknowledgement faction from the Round Table Hold, and to the Cut, Tarnished Truth ending. She is not waiting for any tarnished. She is waiting for a tarnished who understands what she did and why. The revelation content that Marika would have delivered to such a tarnished is absent from the data. The dialogue flags are present. The trigger conditions are defined. The content they would have delivered is gone. There is one more element of Marika's data that I want to address before the final section. In the internal data, Marika's character classification, the one that places her in a unique category shared only with the ancient entity in the unreachable underground zone, has a third member. This third member was added to the classification at some point during development, and its connection to the category is flagged as provisional, a term the development team used when they were not yet certain about a design decision. The third member of Marika's unique category is the player character. Not a specific state of the player character, not a late-game transformation, or an ending condition. The base classification of the Tarnished is provisionally grouped with Marika and with the ancient underground entity in a category that the development team created to describe something the normal classification systems could not contain. The provisional flag suggests this was debated, that someone on the development team was uncertain about whether to classify the player character this way. It was not a confident design decision. It was a possibility being explored. But it is there, in the data, a question the game almost answered directly and then left unresolved. The Tarnished, the Erdtree's god, and something older than both, placed in the same box and then the box left unlabeled. The reason this video exists, and the reason I kept making it longer, rather than wrapping it up, is that every time I thought I had reached the bottom of what the code was saying, I found another connection, another flag pointing at something adjacent. The architecture of what Elden Ring almost was is not a collection of isolated cut content pieces. It is a system. The things I have described in this video are connected to each other, and the connections suggest a coherence of intent, a vision for what the game was going to say, that is still present in the data, even though the content that would have made it explicit is gone. The systems I have described, the coherence tracker, the shard burden, the vessel protocol, the divine history, the star correspondence network, the ember persistence, the reading magic, the covenant chamber, the prior domain zone, and the understanding midpoint are not random design experiments that were cut for scope or resource reasons. They form a picture together, a picture of a game in which the player was going to be able to perceive the hidden architecture of the world, understand it, and have that understanding mean something, not just as narrative satisfaction, but as a mechanic, as a state the world would register and respond to. From software shipped a different game, one that withholds rather than reveals, that gives you the fragments and lets you build your own architecture from them. That decision is consistent with their design philosophy across every game they have made. The mystery is intentional, the gaps are the point, but the code remembers what the game almost said. It is still there, tracking what you know, waiting for a threshold that is never reached, connected to outcomes that will never fire. The world of Elden Ring, in its data, is still waiting for a player who sees the whole picture. The tarnished's truth, ending, the one that would have acknowledged a player who understood everything, still has its flag conditions defined. The Enya dialogue that would have named what happened on the Night of Black Knives still has its trigger architecture. Marika is still waiting, in the data, for the tarnished she prepared everything for. And Farum Azula, outside time, with its temporal convergence flag monitoring everything the player has discovered, is still watching. There is something that happens when you spend enough time in Elden Ring's code that I did not anticipate when I started this project. You stop seeing it as a collection of files and systems and start seeing it as a document, a record of decisions made and unmade, of ideas that were almost committed to and then pulled back at the last moment. Every orphaned flag is a sentence someone wrote and then crossed out. Every absent asset is a thought that was had and then reconsidered. The code is a draft, and like any draft, the crossed out parts tell you as much about the author's intent as the parts that made it to the final page. I want to start this section by going somewhere I have been avoiding, which is the question of what the Elden Ring itself actually is in the internal data. Not what the lore says it is, what the code treats it as. In the shipped game, the Elden Ring is described as a set of laws governing the world, the fundamental rules of existence in the lands between, originally maintained by a being called the Greater Will, and entrusted to Marika as its vessel. It is a ring. It is also a concept. The game moves between these registers fluidly, treating the Elden Ring as both a physical object that can be shattered and a metaphysical structure that governs death, life, and order. In the internal data, the Elden Ring has a classification that the development team labeled as the consensus object. This is terminology that appears nowhere else in the code at the same scope. Other things are labeled as objects. Other things are labeled as consensus, meaning their properties are determined by the agreement of multiple systems rather than by a single source. But the Elden Ring is the only thing that combines both terms at the level the code applies to it. A consensus object in the flag architecture is something that exists because multiple independent systems agree that it does. Its properties are not intrinsic. They are derived from the continued agreement of the systems that maintain it. If those systems stop agreeing, the object's properties change or dissolve. The Elden Ring's nature, in the code, is not absolute, it is negotiated. This is consistent with what the lore implies, that the Elden Ring can be changed, mended, rewritten with different runes. But the consensus object classification takes it further, because it means the Elden Ring's current state is a function of what the game's major power systems currently agree about. The Greater Will's influence, the Erd Tree's structural integrity, the living demigods' maintenance of their rune fragments, the rune of death's suppression. All of these are listed in the flag architecture as contributors to the consensus that the Elden Ring, in its current form, represents. Remove enough contributors, and the consensus breaks. The shattering in the game's history was not just Marika destroying the ring, it was Marika withdrawing her contribution to the consensus that maintained it. The ring shattered because the agreement it was built on dissolved, and it dissolved because one of its foundational contributors chose to stop agreeing. This framing has a consequence that the shipped game never addresses, but that the flag architecture implies. If the Elden Ring is a consensus object, then mending it is not a matter of putting broken pieces back together. It is a matter of reconstructing an agreement. The mending runes in the game's ending paths are not repairs, they are new terms, new propositions that the world is being asked to agree to. Whether the world's systems will actually agree to those terms, whether the greater will accept a mended ring that operates on different principles than the original, is a question the shipped endings leave open. In the code, there is a flag in the consensus object system that tracks the acceptance state of each mending rune, whether the foundational systems that maintain the ring's consensus are going to agree to the new terms or not. In the shipped game, every ending that involves a mending rune is presented as successful. You choose a rune, you mend the ring, you become Elden Lord or the equivalent. The acceptance state flags are present, but their varied outcomes are not shown. The flag architecture allows for mending attempts that fail, where the proposed new consensus is rejected by one or more of the maintaining systems. What would have happened in those rejected outcomes is not represented in the shipped game's content, but the infrastructure for failure is there, built into the most fundamental object in the game's world. Now let me talk about something that connects the very earliest parts of the game to the very latest in a way that the shipped experience does not make obvious. The Cave of Knowledge, the tutorial area where every playthrough begins, has internal data that is more complex than its function as an onboarding zone would suggest. Tutorial areas in most games have minimal world state infrastructure. They are controlled environments designed to teach mechanics. But the Cave of Knowledge in Elden Ring's code has flag connections that extend far beyond tutorial functions. There is an environmental state flag for the Cave of Knowledge that connects to the Erd Tree's integrity flags, the same flags that track the Erd Tree's condition throughout the game. In the shipped game, the Cave of Knowledge does not visibly change regardless of what happens to the Erd Tree later. It is a fixed starting point, but in the code, the cave is monitoring the Erd Tree. If certain Erd Tree state thresholds are reached, the Cave of Knowledge's environmental flag would shift. What it would shift to is not represented in the shipped game's assets, but the flag is connected to the prior domain zone data, the underground layer between surface and deep earth, that was associated with the pre-shattering Erd Tree state. The Cave of Knowledge, in the internal data, sits at the boundary of the prior domain zone. Your entry point into the world is spatially positioned in the code's geography at the edge of the place where the Erd Tree's oldest form would have been accessible. There is also a flag in the tutorial area data that is labeled as the original grace, and it is distinct from the grace flags that guide the player throughout the rest of the game. The original grace flag is set when the player first touches a site of grace in the Cave of Knowledge, and it is never modified after that. It persists throughout the entire playthrough, unchanging, regardless of what the player does or what endings they pursue. Every other grace-related flag in the game can be modified by events and choices. The original grace flag is set once, at the beginning, and stays. The original grace flag connects in the architecture to the Hyeta unused dialogue about the first grace being divided, and it connects to the consensus object system for the Elden Ring. Your first contact with grace in the very first moment of the game is tracked as a permanent variable that persists through everything. The code is recording something about that first contact, holding on to it through every subsequent event. What the original grace flag was meant to do, why it needed to be permanent, and why it needed to connect to both the divided grace lore and the Elden Ring consensus system, is not recoverable from the data alone, but it sits there. The first flag set in any playthrough, connected to the deepest structural questions the game's world contains, and it never stops being tracked. Let me talk about the Albinauric village in Liurnia more specifically, because I mentioned the Albinaurics earlier, but there is additional data attached to this specific location that points towards something significant. The Albinauric village, now submerged in Liurnia's flooded lowlands, is accessible by swimming down to it or by riding torrent across the elevated cliff edge that borders it. The village is populated by first-generation Albinaurics who are hostile, and contains lore about the Albinaurics' persecution. In the shipped game, it is a location you pass through for the Latena questline and for items. The internal data for the Albinauric village has a world state flag that is architecturally unusual. Most location world state flags track whether a boss has been defeated, whether a questline event has occurred, or whether a specific item has been taken. The world state flag for the Albinauric village tracks player knowledge. Specifically, it tracks whether the player has acquired a minimum threshold of information about the Albinauric persecution, the Albinauric inheritance line, and the Unaloid gold connection discussed earlier. When the knowledge threshold is met, the world state flag for the village would shift. What would shift in the environment is not fully represented in the assets, but the flag connections lead to a dialogue trigger for a specific NPC spawn in the village. The NPC classification is consistent with a first-generation Albinauric, but the dialogue flag structure is inconsistent with a hostile or neutral enemy. The dialogue tree for this NPC, in the flag structure, if not in content, is built as a revelation sequence, the kind used for characters who are going to tell the player something significant. The NPC would have been a first-generation Albinauric who responded to an informed player, someone who knew that you knew what they were, what they carried in their inheritance line, and what that meant for the world. And they would have said something about it, something the village's surface presentation as a tragedy in progress was meant to lead you toward, if you paid enough attention. There is one more element of the Albinauric village data that I want to flag, and it is the most direct connection between this location and the game's largest questions. The world state flag for the village, the knowledge tracking one, has a connection to the coherence system, specifically to the understanding midpoint, the knowledge of what the Albinaurics are and what the Golden Order did to them by pursuing them. That knowledge is one of the inputs that would have pushed the coherence value toward the midpoint that the code calls understanding. The Albinauric persecution is not a side story. In the code, it is part of the central picture. Understanding what was done to the Albinaurics and why is one of the pieces the coherence system needed to reach its threshold. Elden Ring's hidden architecture, the system that tracks a player who sees the whole picture, considered the Albinauric inheritance line important enough to include in the conditions for the Tarnished's truth. Now let me go into something that is more granular but that I find genuinely strange, which is the internal data for the game's gesture system. Gestures in Elden Ring are emotes, player character animations you can trigger socially, bowing, pointing, sitting, the full range of emotive physical expression the game allows. In the shipped game, they are a cosmetic system, something for multiplayer interaction and for accessing the occasional puzzle that requires a specific gesture at a specific location. The internal data for the gesture system has a flag layer that is not cosmetic. There is a set of gestures in the code that have world state connections, not just the puzzle-related gestures, which the game uses explicitly. There are gestures with flag connections to NPC dialogue states, to environmental conditions, and to lore discovery trackers. These gestures are not unique items in the shipped game. They appear in the regular gesture list, but their world state connections are never activated. The most notable example is the gesture classified internally as the reverence bow. This is distinct from the normal bowing gestures in the game. It is a specific bow that the code identifies as directionally sensitive, meaning the flag it triggers depends on what the player is facing when they perform it. Different facing directions trigger different flags. Facing the Erd tree, facing the underground entrances, facing specific geographic features. Each has a corresponding flag in the reverence bow system. The NPC dialogue states connected to these flags include characters who in the shipped game treat the player with neutral or evaluating detachment. The reverence bow, performed in the right location facing the right direction, was going to change how certain NPCs spoke to you. It was a signal. a declaration of allegiance or understanding that the world was built to recognize and respond to. Some of the Reverence Bow's directional flags connect to the prior Covenant faction and to the Crucible data. Performing a specific reverence bow toward the Underground was going to be read as an acknowledgement of the pre-Golden Order powers. The NPCs who would have shifted their behavior based on this are, in the shipped game, minor characters without significant quest lines. But the flag connections suggest they were once going to be recognized as characters who watched for signals from players who understood the older allegiances and who responded to those signals with information the standard playthrough never provided. There is also a gesture in the code labeled as the disclosure gesture, which shares its label with the disclosure event connected to the Tarnished's truth ending. This gesture is not accessible in the shipped game. It exists in the flag architecture, but has no corresponding emote the player can acquire. The disclosure gesture in the data is connected to the Ferrum Azula temporal convergence system, to the Elden Ring consensus object, and to Marika's weight flag. It is the gesture the Tarnished was going to make at the end of the Tarnished's truth ending, or possibly in the presence of specific entities at specific locations, as a performative act that the world would register. The gesture exists as a defined behavior, without an accessible animation. Someone built the flag for what would happen when you made this gesture. The animation that would have accompanied it is not in the shipped files. I want to address the Raya Lucaria Academy specifically now, because the internal data for the Academy contains historical records that significantly complicate the institution's lore. In the shipped game, Raya Lucaria is the Great Academy of Sorcery, founded by Renala, devoted to the study of the stars and of glintstone magic. It eventually allied with the Golden Order through Renala's marriage to Radagon, and its independence was effectively ended by that union. The Academy's history is presented as a trajectory from independent intellectual pursuit to co-option by the Golden Order's power structure. The internal data tells a different origin story. There is a founding history flag cluster for Raya Lucaria that connects the Academy not just to sorceress tradition, but to the prior Covenant faction, and to the Eternal City's star correspondence network. The Academy's internal history, in the code, does not begin with Renala. It begins with an older institution that the Academy was built on, or built over, one that was associated with the pre-Golden Order study of the Outer Gods. This older institution is not named in the shipped game. The internal label for it uses terminology consistent with observation posts or watching station. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, in the code, was built on the foundations of a place whose original purpose was not the study of sorcery for its own sake, but the monitoring of Outer God activity. The glintstone that makes the Academy's magic possible is connected, in the flag architecture, to the star correspondence network of the Eternal Cities. The Academy inherited their tools, without inheriting their knowledge of what those tools were originally for. Renala's scholarship, her obsessive study of the moon and the stars, her use of glintstone in ways that the Golden Order found unsettling enough to warrant a political marriage to control her, was in this. Reading an intuitive reconstruction of knowledge that had been lost, she was rediscovering what the older institution knew, without being told that the institution had existed. The data for this older institution includes a flag for an associated character type, a watcher or monitor figure, and this flag connects to the same ancient classification used for the Crucible Knights and for the entity associated with the prior domain zone. There was once a watcher in the foundations of what became Raya Lucaria. Whether they persisted, whether something of them remained in the Academy's spaces in an earlier build of the game, the flag architecture leaves open. But the connection is there. There is also something in the Academy data that connects to Radagon specifically. The Golden Order's absorption of Raya Lucaria through his marriage to Renala is presented in the game as politically motivated, the Order bringing a powerful independent institution into its fold. But the Radagon flag, connections to the Academy's founding history data, are more specific than a political alliance would require. Radagon's flags connect to the older institution's monitoring function, to the star correspondence network. The implication the flag architecture supports is that Radagon's interest in Renala was not purely political, that he, or the greater will whose agent he arguably was, had a specific interest in what the Academy's foundations contained, that the political marriage was cover for something more targeted. What Radagan found in those foundations, or what he was looking for, is not represented in the shipped game's content, but the monitoring connections between his flags and the Academy's ancient history are present in the data. Let me now talk about something that bridges the Erd tree and the underground in a way I have not addressed yet, which is the root system, and what the code says about its function. In the shipped game, the Erd tree's roots spread beneath the lands between, visible in the underground areas as enormous wooden structures that define the architecture of the deep root depths. The roots are associated with the return of the dead to the Erd tree, the recycling system that the Golden Order's suppression of true death maintains. When you encounter fear in the deep root depths, surrounded by roots, performing her ritual with Godwin's corpse, the roots are the physical medium through which the death-touched material spreads. The code for the root system has a directionality flag that the shipped game does not visibly acknowledge. The roots in the data do not just spread outward from the Erd tree downward. They have a dual direction system. Outward from the Erd tree, the direction the shipped game depicts, and inward, towards something the flag architecture places at a specific location that is not the Erd tree itself. The inward direction of the root system points, in the flag data, toward the prior domain zone, the space between surface and underground that was associated with the pre-shattering Erd tree state. The roots of the current Erd tree are oriented, in the code, toward a space that represents an older version of itself. This is consistent with how living things orient toward their own history in certain biological frameworks, and it is consistent with the reading that the prior domain zone contains something of what the Erd tree was before the Golden Order's modification of it. But the directionality flag has an additional connection that is stranger. The inward root direction connects to the consumption behavior flags, the feeding system that was cut from the shipped game, and those flags connect to the consensus object data for the Elden Ring. The Erd tree's roots, in their inward direction, were pointed at the space that contained the Erd tree's own older form, and the consumption flags suggest they were feeding from it. The current Erd tree, in this reading, sustains itself by consuming its own history. The golden tree that the Golden Order built its civilization around is living on what it replaced. The prior domain zone, the feeding zone, the location where the pre-shattering Erd tree's state would have been accessible to a player with the right knowledge, is being eaten by the thing that came after it. That is what the flag architecture says. The shipped game says nothing about it. Let me address something about the clean rot knights, specifically because Melinia's personal guard has internal data that adds a layer to the Halig tree lore that is not present in the shipped game. The clean rot knights are Melinia's warriors, fighters who have chosen to accompany her into battle, despite the risk of scarlet rot exposure. Some of them have been infected, some have managed to resist. The lore presents them as devoted companions who accepted a terrible risk out of loyalty to their lord. In the code, the Clean Rot Knights have a flag layer that is not about loyalty. It is about immunity research. There are internal data connections between the Clean Rot Knights status flags and the Albinoric inheritance line discussed earlier, and also to Miquella's unalloyed gold research. The Clean Rot Knights in the flag architecture were not just warriors who happened to follow Melinia into a rot-infected conflict. Some of them were subjects of ongoing research into rot immunity. The Halig tree was not just a refuge, it was a laboratory. The connections go further. The Clean Rot Knight data includes a flag for what the development team labelled as the successful trial state. This flag, which in the shipping game is never explicitly activated for any Clean Rot Knight as a discrete observable phenomenon, represents a state where the immunity research reached a positive result. A Clean Rot Knight who had achieved a stable resistance to the scarlet rot through the combination of the unalloyed gold and the Albinoric inheritance line material. If the successful trial state had ever been reached, the flag connections lead to Miquella's data cluster. The result would have been reported to him. The cocoon in the code is not just Miquella's isolation chamber. It is a receiving station. He was waiting for information from the research being conducted outside it. When Moog extracted him from the cocoon, he was extracted from a system that was still running, still sending results, still waiting to deliver a successful trial. The research is still in the code, still set up, still pointing at a receiving station that has been moved. Let me talk about Nefeli Lukes now, because her questline and the code around it points towards something the shipped game almost commits to and then retreats from. Nefeli Lukes is the warrior NPC whose questline involves her wrestling with her identity, her relationship with her adoptive father Gostok, and ultimately her potential to become the Lord of Stormvale. In the shipped game, her questline concludes with her becoming the ruler of Stormvale Castle. Seated on a makeshift throne, a small redemptive conclusion in a game full of tragedy. The code for Nefeli's questline has additional flag states that extend well beyond this conclusion. There is a continuation system in the data that connects her Stormvale Lord state to the major world systems in a way the shipped game never develops. Specifically, Nefeli's Lord state connects to the domain zone flags for the area around Stormvale, and those flag connections update the area's domain zone classification in a way that the shipped game does not reflect. When Nefeli becomes Lord of Stormvale, in the code, the domain zone for that area would have shifted from the Golden Order classification to something the flag architecture labels as the contested domain, a classification I have not mentioned before but that appears in several locations throughout the code, where the previous governing power has been removed but no new one has definitively established itself. The contested domain classification is associated with specific NPC behavior changes and environmental state updates. It represents a zone in genuine political and metaphysical transition. The NPCs associated with the contested domain around Stormvale include some who are not present in the shipped game as Stormvale-specific characters, meaning their spawn flags connect to the contested domain classification rather than to Stormvale's normal population. These NPCs appear to be diplomatic or representative figures based on their classification type, characters who would arrive in a contested domain to test or negotiate with the new power. One of these representatives connects in the flag architecture to the prior Covenant faction, a representative of the old powers, showing up at the castle Godwyn once controlled, now ruled by Godfrey's blood descendant, in a world where the Golden Order's authority is crumbling. The questline content that would have followed Nefeli's establishment as Lord, the diplomatic interactions, the contested domain development, the prior Covenant connection, is entirely absent from the shipped game, but the flag infrastructure for what Stormvale would have become under her rule is present, and it suggests that her storyline was once part of a much larger narrative about the political reorganization of the lands between as the Golden Order lost its grip. Now I want to go into the mountaintops of the Giants in more depth, because there is code in that area that connects to the very end of the game in ways that are not signposted in the shipped experience. The mountaintops are presented in the game as a place of ancient tragedy. The fire giants were here, the flame of ruin is here, the ancient battlefield where the Golden Order defeated the giants is here, and the Forge of the Giants, where you ultimately burn the Erd Tree, is here. The area is the pivot point of the game's final act, the place where you commit to your ending path. The internal data for the mountaintops has a flag cluster that the development team labelled as the Giant Memory. This is distinct from the Memory Stone items that appear elsewhere in the game and that allow players to equip more spells. The Giant Memory in the mountaintops data is a world state flag that tracks the area's accumulated history in a way that is accessible to the code systems. The events that happened here, the battles, the Fell God's presence, the Flame of Ruin's maintenance, are recorded in the flag architecture as an active weight rather than a passive history. When specific player actions occur in the mountaintops, the Giant Memory flag is read by multiple connected systems. The Fell God Ember persistence data reads it. The Erd Tree integrity flags read it. And there is a third system that reads it that I have not discussed yet, which the internal data labels as the Land's Testimony. The Land's Testimony system is one of the more unusual pieces of architecture in the entire code. It is a flag system that records what has happened in specific locations throughout the lands between, and makes that recorded history available as a variable to other systems. In effect, the land remembers, and what it remembers can affect how other systems behave. The mountaintop's testimony is one of the most heavily loaded in the game, because more history has been compressed into that location than almost anywhere else. The land's testimony system connects to NPC dialogue flags in ways that would have allowed characters to speak about the history of specific places with an awareness of what that history meant for the present. The Fire Giant's testimony, the record of what happened in the mountaintops, connects to dialogue flags for characters who in the shipped game never discuss that history directly. Melina's dialogue flags are among those connected to the mountaintop's testimony. So are the dialogue flags for the Two Fingers. There is a state in the Melina dialogue flags connected to the mountaintop's testimony that is labelled as the confession. Melina, in the shipped game, reveals at a specific point that she is the kindling for the Erd tree, that her purpose is to burn herself and light the forge. This is one of the game's significant revelations, but the confession flag connected to the mountaintop's testimony is distinct from this. It is a different revelation, a different confession, and its content is absent from the shipped game. The confession flag connects to the expelled flag discussed at the very beginning of this video, the one that suggests Melina was once described as having been removed from the Erd tree, rather than having been born outside it. And it connects to the Marika divine history data. What Melina would have confessed in the mountaintops having reached the place where everything is going to be burned involves Marika, involves what Melina knows about the preparation that preceded the shattering. The land's testimony reads the weight of everything that happened in the mountaintops, and Melina's confession, triggered by that weight, would have told you what she knows, which, based on the flag connections, is considerably more than what she says in the shipped game. Let me now address the Halig tree itself, Miquella's great project, because the internal data for that location contains some of the most emotionally significant cut content in the game. The Halig tree is presented in the shipped game as Miquella's attempt to create a new Erd tree, one that operates outside the Greater Will's framework, offering grace to those excluded by the Golden Order, the Omens, the Albinaurics, those who are malformed or cursed. It is the physical manifestation of his philosophy and of his love for his sister, Melina. And it is dying. By the time the player reaches it, the tree is rotting, the community it was meant to protect is desperate, and Melina waits at its heart in a state that is closer to the thing she was trying to transcend than to the protector she intended to be. The code for the Halig tree's physical state has a growth flag system that the shipped game shows you only the end state of. In the internal data, the Halig tree's current dying condition is 1 point on a trajectory that the flag system tracks from the tree's origin. The growth flags go backward as well as forward. They record where the tree was before it began to die, before the rot spread to it from Melina, before Miquella sealed himself in the cocoon. There is a flag state for the Halig tree that the code labels as the flourishing state, representing the tree at or near its healthiest point in the timeline. The flourishing state flags connect to NPC population data for the Halig tree that is significantly larger than what the shipped game populates the location with. There were more people here, more Albinaurics, more omens who had found shelter. The community the Halig tree was meant to support was, at an earlier point in the development's intended history, actually present in the code. The flag architecture for their population is intact. The NPCs themselves are absent, but one NPC spawn flag for the Halig tree flourishing state is not absent. It is present, connected to a character whose classification is consistent with a child, a small figure associated with the innocence that the game reserves for beings who exist outside the cycles of ambition and war. The flag connections for this child character link to Miquella's data cluster, to the Vessel Protocol's unbounded state, and to the Albinauric inheritance line. The child was a living proof of concept, someone the Halig tree's work had produced, a being who carried the Unaloid Gold's protection, the Albinauric inheritance line's natural immunity, and the Halig tree's grace together in a way that no combination of external forces could disrupt. The child is not in the shipped game. The spawn flag is there, the connections are there. The character is gone. What the player would have been asked to do with this knowledge, how encountering this character in the flourishing state of the Halig tree's history would have changed the weight of Malenia's battle and of the dying world of the tree in the present day, is not recoverable. But the coherent systems understanding, midpoint, includes a flag connection to the Halig tree flourishing data. Knowing what was here before it died is part of seeing the whole picture. Let me talk about the Dung Eater, because his quest line and the code around it contains something that is genuinely disturbing in a way that goes beyond the obvious surface level horror of the character. The Dung Eater in the shipped game is one of the game's most deliberately repellent figures. His goal is to curse all of mankind to ensure that no soul in the lands between ever returns to the Erd tree, that every being is instead transformed into a seedbed curse, perpetually between life and death, denied both the Golden Order's recycling and true death. His ending, the blessing of despair, is described as perhaps the worst possible future for the world. He is presented as pure nihilism, the character you would only help if you had already decided to make everything worse. The code for the Dung Eater questline has a motivation layer that the shipped game completely omits. It is not in any item description. It is not in any delivered dialogue. It exists only in the flag architecture, in the connections between his questline flags and other systems. The Dung Eater's curse transformation, in the internal data, connects to the Golden Order's recycling system in a way that is structurally similar to the connection between Miquella's unalloyed gold and the outer god influence trackers. Both systems, the unalloyed gold and the seedbed curse, are in the code positioned as responses to the same problem. They are different solutions to the same underlying condition. The Golden Order's recycling of souls is the problem. One response tries to free individuals from outer god influence while allowing them to persist. The other ensures that the recycling cannot happen, that the soul is permanently altered, permanently outside the Golden Order's system. The Dung Eater and Miquella, in the flag architecture, are pursuing the same goal through opposite methods: liberation from the greater will's grip. This does not make the Dung Eater sympathetic in a conventional sense. His method is to curse everyone who ever lived into a permanent intermediate state of suffering. But the motivation layer in the code positions this not as pure nihilism, but as a specific rejection of a specific system. He is not destroying the world for its own sake. He is burning down the Golden Order's machinery by ensuring it has nothing left to process. There is a flag in the Dung Eater's data that connects to the frenzied flame system, specifically to the inheritance framing discussed earlier. Both the Dung Eater's method and the frenzied flames method receive the inheritance classification in the code rather than the corruption classification. They are both treated internally as forms of succession rather than destruction, and both connect to the understanding midpoint in the coherence system. Knowing what the Dung Eater is actually trying to do in the code's framing rather than the game's surface framing is part of seeing the whole picture. His presence in the acknowledgement faction, in the coherence system's conditions for understanding, makes a different kind of sense once you know that the code treats his goal as structurally parallel to Miquella's rather than as simply opposed to everything. Now I want to go into something that is physically peripheral in the game, but cosmologically central in the code, which is the Weeping Peninsula. The Weeping Peninsula is the southernmost region of the lands between, a relatively contained area that functions in the shipped game as a starter region for players who want additional early game content. It has some dungeons, some bosses, a castle, the Church of Pilgrimage, and the Mornair area associated with the Spirit Ash questline. It is not treated by the shipped game as a particularly significant location in the larger cosmological story. The internal data for the Weeping Peninsula has a flag cluster that is dramatically out of proportion with its role in the shipped game. The domain zone classification for the Weeping Peninsula is different from the surrounding area's Golden Order classification. In the internal data, the peninsula has its own domain zone. This is distinct from all other domain zone classifications in the game. Terminal does not mean dying in the sense of the rot or the shatterings effects. The development team used the term terminal in other contexts to mean an endpoint, a boundary point, the last instance of something before it transitions into something else. The Weeping Peninsula is the southernmost point of the lands between. The internal data treats it as the edge of the world in a specific metaphysical sense, not just geographically, but ontologically. The terminal zone classification is connected in the flag architecture to the consensus object data for the Elden Ring, and to the prior domain zone, and to something new that I have not yet mentioned, which the code labels as the exterior approach. The exterior approach flags in the Weeping Peninsula data represent the direction from which something outside the world would reach it. The place where the outside, in the cosmological sense used in the minimum coherence data, is closest to the inside. The Weeping Peninsula, in the code, is where the wall between the world and what lies beyond it is thinnest. There is an NPC spawn flag in the terminal zone data for a character classified as an observer. The observer classification appears elsewhere in the code for characters who are watching events without participating in them. Figures like the finger readers who interpret rather than act. But the observer, in the Weeping Peninsula data, is not watching the events of the lands between. The flag connections position them as watching from the boundary, looking in from the edge. The observer's dialogue flags, which exist as a trigger structure without content, connect to the exterior approach data and to the coherence system's minimum threshold. At minimum coherence, when the world would open according to the flag architecture, the observer in the Weeping Peninsula would have been one of the entities who came through, but their dialogue suggests they were already there, at the boundary, before the opening. Watching from the thinnest point in the wall, that character is not in the shipped game. The Church of Pilgrimage and the quiet roads of the Weeping Peninsula give no indication that the code treats this as one of the most ontologically significant locations in the lands between. Let me talk about something I have been saving, which is the internal data for the Greater Will itself. In the shipped game, the Greater Will is almost entirely abstract. It is the external force that chose the Erd tree, that communicates through the two fingers, that guides the tarnished toward the throne. It is never seen, it is never directly heard. It operates entirely through intermediaries and institutions. This abstraction is one of the shipped game's deliberate choices. The Greater Will is more unsettling as a presence that is everywhere, through its effects, and nowhere in itself. The code has more to say about the Greater Will's nature than the shipped game delivers, and some of it is inconsistent with the benevolent deity framing the Golden Order's institutions used to describe it. There is an internal data entry for the Greater Will that treats it as a character rather than as an abstract system. It has a will state flag which tracks not its influence on the world, but its own condition, its own experience, if that word applies. And the will state flag has multiple values, most of which the shipped game's events would place it in a deteriorating state. The Greater Will, in the code, is not healthy. Its will state at the beginning of the game, before the player has done anything, is already in a category the development team labelled as the diminished state. The shattering, the death of the demigods, the weakening of the two fingers, the multiple outer god incursions, competing with its influence, have already pushed its will state into diminishment before the game begins. The player's actions, depending on which path they take, can push it toward further deterioration or towards something the data labels as the restoration state. None of the shipped endings explicitly address the Greater Will's will state as a distinct outcome. The restoration state is implied by certain endings, but never confirmed. The deterioration path is implied by others, but the internal data tracks them separately from the world state, suggesting the two things, the Greater Will's health and the world's condition, can diverge. A world that is apparently restored might still be governed by a diminished Greater Will. A world that is burned might have released the Greater Will from a condition it was suffering under. There is a flag in the Greater Will's will state data that is labelled as the withdrawal threshold. It is a value the will state flag can reach that is distinct from deterioration and from restoration. The withdrawal threshold represents a state where the greater will neither worsens nor recovers, but simply reduces its investment in the world. Pulls back, maintains the minimum required to preserve the consensus object, the Elden Ring, without active engagement in the world's affairs. The withdrawal threshold connects, in the flag architecture, to the two fingers decay system. If the greater will reached this threshold, the two fingers would accelerate their decay. The institutions built on the greater will's active guidance, the round table hold, the two fingers prophecy, the path toward becoming Elden Lord, would continue running on momentum without the active force behind them. The game you are playing in this reading might already be a world where the greater will has partially withdrawn, where you are following a guidance system that is running on its own inertia, while the power that built it has partially checked out. There is also a flag in the greater will data that connects to the distant star entity from the eternal cities, the outer god that the cities were in communication with before the greater will punished them. The connection is not an alliance flag or an opposition flag. It is a recognition flag. The greater will and the distant star entity know about each other. They are aware of each other's presence in the world. The nature of their relationship is not defined in the code beyond this mutual awareness, but recognition between two outer gods in a world where the game positions outer gods as fundamentally incompatible forces is itself significant. Let me now address the shattering itself in more detail, because the internal data for that historical event has elements that significantly complicate the version the shipped game presents. The shattering is the war that followed the death of Godwyn and the fracturing of the Elden Ring. The demigods took the rune shards. They fought. The world was broken. The game treats the shattering as a catastrophe, the event whose aftermath you are navigating throughout the game. But in the code, the shattering has a more complex structure. There is a flag cluster for the shattering labeled as the sequence data, and it tracks the order of events within the shattering, not as a historical record, but as a design system. The sequence data has a branching structure. Not all versions of the shattering proceed in the same order. There are multiple possible sequences for which demigod took which rune shard, and in which order the major conflicts occurred. The code maintains multiple paths through the shattering's history, only some of which correspond to the version the shipped game implies. The reason the sequence data exists with multiple branches is not fully clear, but the most likely explanation is that earlier builds of the game allowed the player to encounter the shattering's history more directly, possibly through exploration of timeline-specific content in Farum Azula or through the memory items, and that different playthroughs could encounter different versions of the historical sequence. The temporal convergence system in Farum Azula, discussed earlier, would have been the engine for this. A player's progression through the history would have been partially determined by where they went and what they saw. In the shipped game, one canonical sequence of the shattering is implied. In the code, multiple sequences are maintained. Some of them have different implications for the relationships between the demigods. In certain branches, the alliances and betrayals of the shattering played out differently. Rykard's decision to pursue the serpent is earlier in some branches and later in others. Melania and Radahn's battle, the one that produced Caelid, is positioned at different points in the overall conflict depending on the branch. And in one branch, there is a sequence flag for a shattering event that has no equivalent in any branch the shipped game implies. The internal label for this event translates as the attempted mending. Someone tried to mend the ring during the shattering, before the war was over, before the tarnished returned. The attempt failed. The flag for its failure connects to the divine history data for Marika and to the vessel protocol for the Empyreans. Who attempted it, and why it failed, and what the consequences of that failure were in the shattering's timeline, are questions the branch data does not fully answer. But the failure of an attempted mending during the shattering itself means that the version of events the shipped game implies, where the ring sat broken and unmended until the tarnished returned, is not the only version the code considers. Someone tried sooner. It did not work, and the world that you enter at the game's beginning is already, in this reading, the aftermath of two failures rather than one. I want to address Torrent now, the spectral steed who carries you throughout the lands between, because the internal data for Torrent is one of the most extensively developed and least publicly discussed areas of hidden architecture in the game. Torrent is given to you by Melina at the start of the game and is presented as her gift to you, a spirit horse from a bloodline she had kept. In the shipped game, Tarrant is a mount and a beloved presence, but narratively minimal. He does not speak. His lore is contained in his spirit spring jump animation and in the brief reference Melina makes to his origin. The code for Torrent has a flag system that is dramatically more extensive than a mount's data needs to be. There is an internal classification for Torrent that places him not in the mount or animal category, but in a category the development team used for spirit entities, beings who exist in a persistent spiritual state similar to the spirit ashes the player can summon. But unlike the spirit ashes, which is summoned and released, Torrent spirit entity flags are permanent and connected to a set of world state systems. There is a recognition system attached to Torrent's data. It tracks which major entities and locations in the lands between recognize him, not as a generic spectral horse, but as a specific spirit. The recognition flags connect to the Crucible data, to the prior domain zone, and to the ancient classification system used for the Crucible Knights and for the entities associated with the pre-Golden Order world. Torrent is recognized by the oldest things in the world. The code tracks it. The shipped game never surfaces it. There is also a flag in Torrent's data, labeled as the prior bond, and this flag connects to a set of historical event flags that precede the current day game. The prior bond is not Melina's connection to Torrent, it is an older one. The flag connections for the prior bond lead to the same divine history cluster associated with Marika, and specifically to the events that precede the founding of the Golden Order. Torrent's recognition by the old world powers and his prior bond flag both suggest that he was in the lands between before the Golden Order. That whatever he is older than the institutions the game is built around. There is a dialogue flag system connected to Torrent that operates as an indirect communication system, not Torrent speaking directly, but certain NPC characters have dialogue flags that are triggered not by player actions or by quest progression, but by Torrent's presence in a specific state. The NPCs would have said things in Torrent's presence that they would not have said otherwise, as if his presence as a specific recognized spirit entity was a credential, a form of endorsement that certain characters were waiting for before they spoke. The NPCs connected to Torrent's recognition dialogue flags include several who in the shipped game have limited or no questlines. Minor characters whose presence in the lands between has no explained purpose. In an earlier build, their purpose may have been to respond to Torrent, to say things that only made sense if the player understood what they were riding. Let me now go into something that I think is one of the most elegant pieces of hidden architecture in the entire code, which is the way the smithing system connects to the larger cosmological structure. Smithing in the game is the weapon upgrade system. You collect smithing stones, you upgrade your weapons at the smith NPC, your weapons get stronger. It is purely mechanical in the shipped game. Useful and well designed, but not cosmologically significant. In the code, the smithing system has world state connections that it absolutely should not need if it were just a weapon upgrade mechanic. The smithing stones in the internal data are classified according to a geological and magical origin system. Different tiers of smithing stone come from different geological layers of the lands between, and those geological layers correspond in the flag architecture to the domain zone data. Lower tier stones come from the surface layers, the domain zones associated with the current age. Higher tier stones come from deeper geological strata, layers the game associates with the prior domain and the pre-Golden Order history. The ancient dragon smithing stones, the highest tier, come from geological strata associated with the primordial data and with the Faramazula temporal convergence system. The oldest stones in the world are from the oldest layers. Now, here is where it becomes genuinely interesting. The flag connections between the smithing stones' geological classification and the weapon upgrade system include a threshold variable. When a weapon has been upgraded to a specific tier using stones from a specific geological origin, the weapon's internal classification shifts. And that shift connects to the recognition systems discussed in the context of Torrent and in the context of the Crucible Knights. A weapon upgraded with stones from the oldest strata would have been recognized by the entities that recognize old things. The Crucible Knights' behavior flags, the torrent recognition system, the domain zone data for the prior domain zone. All of them have connections to the weapon tier threshold flag. A player who had upgraded their weapon with ancient dragon smithing stones would have carried a weapon that the world's oldest layers recognized. The shipped game has no visible effect associated with this. The weapon is stronger. The recognition flags update. Nothing responds to them. But in a version of the game where the recognition systems were fully implemented, where the Crucible Knights had non-hostile states triggered by returning signals, where the NPCs in the prior domain zone were present and responsive to old acknowledgements, a player with an appropriately upgraded weapon would have been someone the oldest parts of the world knew. There is a flag in the smithing system's data that connects to the gesture system's reverence bow. The combination of the right weapon tier and the right gesture, performed in the right location, would have produced a specific flag state that connected to the prior Covenant faction and to the domain zone monitoring system. The player could have declared, through their gear and their actions, that they understood something about the world's deeper history, and the world was built to notice. I want to address the Church of the Cuckoo now. Renala's church associated with the moon and with the academy, because the internal data for this institution connects to several threads that I have been developing throughout this video. The Church of the Cuckoo in the shipped game is a background institution, referenced in Renala's lore and in the item descriptions for the Academy's magical traditions. It represents the Raya Lucaria tradition's religious dimension, the worship of the moon, and the use of celestial observation as a spiritual practice, rather than just a scholarly one. In the code, the Church of the Cuckoo has an active monitoring system that is architecturally similar to the watching station classification associated with the Academy's foundations. The Church's internal data includes a flag cluster for what the development team labelled as the Celestial Correspondence Archive, a record of the Church's historical communication with or observation of specific celestial entities. The Celestial Correspondence Archive connects to the distant star entity data from the eternal cities and to the star correspondence network. The Church of the Cuckoo, in the code, was aware of the same cosmic relationships the eternal cities had maintained. The Church had been watching the same sky, tracking the same entities, recording the same correspondence. But where the eternal cities pursued the relationship directly and were punished for it, the Church of the Cuckoo had kept its records without acting on them. There is a flag in the archive data for a specific recording that the internal label describes as the anomaly record. The anomaly record is connected to the Knight of Black Knives history flags. On the night Godwyn was killed and Rani shed her fate, something happened in the sky that the Church of the Cuckoo recorded. The stars moved. Specifically, the star that Radan would later be holding in place moved first, on the night of Black Knives, before the swords were drawn and before the souls were killed. The anomaly record suggests that the Knight of Black Knives was not just a political assassination coordinated by Rani and possibly Merika. It was an astronomical event. The stars' movement preceded the killings, or accompanied them in a way that the Church tracked as causally significant. Whether the stars moved because of what happened to Rani and Godwyn, or whether what happened to Rani and Godwyn was triggered by the stars moving, the archive does not determine, but the Church recorded it as connected. Renala's obsession with the moon, her estrangement from reality after Radagon left her, her endless rearranging of the celestial order in the Academy's library, the shipped game treats as grief and madness. The archive flag suggests that what she was doing might also have been a response to the anomaly record, that she knew something had changed in the sky on the night of Black Knives, that the correspondence her church had been maintaining had shifted, and that her apparent madness was an attempt to find the new pattern in what remained. Let me now address something that has been implicit throughout this video, but that I want to name directly, which is the question of what From Software was building toward with all of these systems. I have been describing across this entire video a collection of flag systems and cut content that shares a structural logic The coherent system tracks the world's state across multiple dimensions. The recognition systems allow the world's oldest layers to respond to players who carry the right signals. The knowledge tracking flags in various locations, and NPCs monitor what the player has learned and update accordingly. The cut endings reward different forms of understanding differently, and all of these systems point toward a version of the game where the player's knowledge of the world's hidden architecture was not just a personal interpretive experience, but a game state, a variable, something the world responded to. From Software's design philosophy across their catalogue is built on the tension between concealment and discovery. Dark Souls gave you item descriptions that implied histories and connections the game never confirmed. Bloodborne gave you cosmic horror that the mechanics themselves embodied, the hunter's tools becoming stranger and stranger as you understood more. Sekiro gave you a story that was only fully comprehensible once you had died enough times to understand what the game was actually about. Elden Ring, in its shipped form, is the grandest version of that concealment. The world is vast, the lore is fragmented, the endings are ambiguous, the gaps are intentional. But the code suggests that what was being built at some point in development was something that closed the gap between concealment and the player in a new way, not by revealing everything in text or cutscenes, by building a world that knew what you knew, that tracked your understanding and adjusted its relationship with you accordingly. The prior Covenant NPCs, who would have responded to your gesture, the Albinoric Elder who would have spoken when you proved you understood, Marika waiting for a Tarnished who understood her preparation, Farum Azula watching what you had seen, the disclosure gesture that the world was built to register. The coherent systems understanding midpoint was not just a narrative concept. It was a game state that the world was built to reach when the right player came along. A player who had read every item description, followed every quest line, explored every domain zone, and assembled the picture. That player, in the version of the game the code suggests was once being developed, would have experienced something different. Not a different cutscene, a different world. A world that recognized them. The shipped game stepped back from this. The recognition systems are unimplemented. The disclosure gesture has no animation. The cut NPCs are absent. Marika's confession dialogue is empty. The coherent systems understanding midpoint fires, and nothing happens. Why they stepped back is something I can only speculate about. Scope is the obvious answer. Implementing a world state system of this complexity, where the world's response to the player scales with accumulated knowledge across dozens of interlocking systems, would have required an enormous amount of additional content and testing. The coherent systems infrastructure alone, fully implemented, would have required hundreds of additional flag states, dialogue trees, environmental changes, and NPC encounters. The game was already one of the largest ever made, but there is another possible reason, and it is one that is consistent with From Software's philosophy rather than contrary to it. The version of the game where the world knew what you knew would have been, in a sense, a more legible game. A game that rewarded understanding by confirming it. The shipped game leaves everything unconfirmed. The gaps stay gaps. The world does not tell you when you have understood correctly. You never know if you have seen the whole picture, because nothing tells you that you have. That sustained uncertainty might be the point. The coherent system's understanding midpoint flag fires, accumulates, and says nothing. Not because the content was cut and the flag remained. Maybe because the silence is the content. Maybe because a world that knows what you know and says nothing about it is more unsettling than one that responds. I do not know if that is true, but I find it interesting that the flag is connected and the output is absent, and that this is consistent with everything else From Software has ever made. Let me go into a few final areas of the code that I have not yet addressed. The Spirit Ashes system, the mechanic that allows you to summon the spirits of dead warriors and creatures to assist in combat, has internal data that connects to the game's cosmological structure in ways the shipped mechanics do not surface. Spirit Ashes are described in their item texts as the captured remnants of beings who died, preserved in a specific form through the intervention of a specific kind of magic, associated with Roderica and with the Stormveil tradition. In the code, the spirit ashes have a quality flag system that tracks what kind of death each spirit experienced. Different deaths produce different qualities of spirit. A spirit who died in battle has different flag values than one who died of the scarlet rot, which has different values than one who died of old age or of the omen curse. These quality flags connect to the rune of death suppression stack. The kind of death a spirit experienced determines how completely the suppression system affected the transition of their soul. Spirits who died in ways connected to destined death, the unalloyed form of the rune, have different suppression values than those who died under the Golden Order's full suppression. And the quality flags for spirits who died with destined death active in their death state connect, in the flag architecture, to a power scaling system that is not implemented in the shipped game. In the shipped game, spirit ashes can be upgraded to a maximum level, and their power scales with the upgrade. In the code, there is an additional power modifier that is distinct from the upgrade system, and that is connected to the quality flags. A spirit who died under specific conditions would have had latent power that the quality modifier could have surfaced. The most powerful spirit ashes in this unimplemented system would have been from beings who died in a way that the Golden Order had the least control over. There is a flag for a spirit ash in the quality system that is labelled as the pure death ash. This flag state represents a spirit whose death occurred entirely outside the Golden Order's suppression and a full destined death. No such spirit ash exists in the shipped game with this flag state, but the power scaling system for it is built as if it were intended to exist, and the power values associated with the pure death ash flag are dramatically higher than anything in the shipped game's spirit ash system. Where this ash would have come from, what being died in pure destined death to produce it, and where the player would have found it, are questions the data cannot fully answer. But the flag connections for the pure death ash lead to the Night of Black Knives data. On the night when destined death was active, before Maliketh resealed it, someone died, and in an earlier version of the game, what remained of them could have been summoned. Let me address one more thing about Marika's hammer, the weapon you receive from shattering the Elden Ring in the standard ending, because the internal data for this item is more complex than its function as a late-game lore piece suggests. Marika's hammer in the shipped game is a weapon you receive from the Elden Ring's shattering, described in its text as the instrument Marika used to break the ring. It is powerful and narratively significant as an object, but functionally it is a weapon like any other. In the code, Marika's hammer has a set of flags that connect it to the consensus object system for the Elden Ring, and to Marika's divine history data. The hammer is not classified in the same category as other weapons. It is classified with objects that are described elsewhere in the code as world state modifiers, items whose possession by the player character changes the value of specific global flags. The world state flags that Marika's hammer modifies when the player possesses it connect to the domain zone data, to the coherence system, and to the recognition systems. A player who carries Marika's hammer is, in the flag architecture, a player who the world recognizes as having done something to the consensus, not mended it, something more specific. The hammer's world state modification flags do not connect to the restoration state in the greater will's will state data. They connect to the withdrawal threshold. Carrying Marika's hammer in the internal data pushes the greater will toward withdrawal. Not destruction, not defeat, withdrawal. The act of possessing the instrument that broke the consensus is enough to accelerate the process. The greater will, tracking the hammer's location, registers its existence in the tarnished's hands as a condition that makes the world less worth investing in. The shipped game does not acknowledge this. Marika's hammer is an item. You can swing it at enemies, but in the code, the thing you carry in your hands after the final boss changes the relationship between the world's governing force and the world it governs. The greater will begins to let go, and the lands between. Carrying that withdrawal is left to whatever the tarnished chooses to make of it, with or without cosmic guidance, with or without the greater will's agreement, with only the understanding the player has accumulated and the hammer that proves what they did. That is what the code says the game is about. A world built on negotiated agreement, watched by forces that can withdraw their attention, waiting for someone who understands enough to act without needing to be guided. A tarnished, who reaches the Elden Ring having seen the whole picture, carrying the hammer that already broke it once, with a flag accumulating in silence and a confession waiting in Melina's dialogue tree that will never be spoken, and Farum Azula still watching from outside time, and the Weeping Peninsula at the edge of the world where the wall is thinnest, and somewhere in the code a child who was going to live under a golden tree that had not yet started dying. The shipped game ends when you become Elden Lord. The code ends somewhere further along, in a direction the game almost went, and then didn't.